LoveLore Library. Chapter 161. The great desert stretched into the heavens, stretching as far as the eye could see. The sun seemed to be right above their heads, spreading out a terrifying burning aura. As far as the eye could see, there was nothing but yellow sand. There wasn't the least bit of color or life. Wild winds rose and fell, sweeping up grains of sand that blotted out the sky. Then, one towering yellow sand mountain after another was formed. These sand mountains were scattered deep within the desert. What was strange was that no matter how strong the winds blew, they never fell down from the day they were born. In fact, they didn't even move at all, as if there was an invisible strength suppressing everything. Until one day, a star fell from the sky, smashing open a terrifying pit in the desert. A cauldron appeared in his line of sight. It was smashed apart by the star, revealing a palm-sized bead within. The entire bead was yellow, like jade but not jade. It had a glossy luster. As the bead appeared, the surrounding desert for 1,000 miles sank down, as if it couldn't bear the weight. Chinyu opened his eyes and digested the memories in his soul. Within his Dantian sea, there was an earth attribute bead that was silent. The willow branches gently swayed, sprinkling down a vast expanse of green divine light as they cheered in joy. Water, wood, fire, earth. Of the 5 elements, there was only one missing, metal. His soul still had strength left over, so refining a metal attribute spiritual object wasn't difficult at all. Chinyu lifted his hand and swallowed a pill, quietly restoring his losses. He wanted to refine the metal attribute spiritual object in a single go and gather all 5 elements together. But at this time, someone knocked on the door to his workroom. Chinyu frowned, a thoughtful look in his eyes. With his current status and identity, the only people who would dare to disturb him even though he was in seclusion were those people from the royal palace. He opened the door and saw Chief Manager Wu personally accompanying him. Old C was silent, as if he weren't happy. The indifferent young sea folk bowed. "Greetings, Honorable Ning. Soup Man has invited you. If there has been any disturbance, I hope Honorable Ning can be magnanimous enough to forgive me." His voice was gentle and polite, his tone calm and composed. Chinyu nodded. All right. Since Old C was here, then he clearly knew. Since he didn't stop him, there was no need for him to say anything more. "Thank you, Honorable Ning. The carriage is waiting outside. I will wait for you." "Honorable Ning, there is no harm in tidying up." He bowed and left. It was clear he wanted to give Chinyu a chance to inquire. Old C said, "Things have changed." He hesitated for a moment before saying, "Little friend Ning, if possible, please do your best. This is a secret, so I can't say much about it. You will naturally know once you enter the palace. However, if things don't work out, little friend doesn't need to worry too much. With your current status in the sea race, no one can casually touch you." Helplessness flashed in Chinyu's heart. As expected, however, he did not reveal anything on his face. After all, he had already expected this to happen. A moment later, Chinyu stepped into Sea's spirit pavilion. His robes were still black, but there was a purple jade pendant hanging from his waist. This item had the ability to repair itself, so even though it had been badly damaged that day, it was now as good as new. Several carriages were neatly arranged with the insignia of the royal family on them. Countless members of the sea folk revealed looks of awe, but when they saw the black-robed figure walk out, they suddenly understood. It was no wonder that the royal family valued him so much and was willing to wait quietly. Only this great master could do that. The sea folk stopped, cupped their hands, and bowed. Chinyu nodded in return and boarded the carriage. With a shout, the carriage slowly began to move. The royal carriage passed through the streets, unimpeded along the way. As it passed by Prosperity Square, Qin Yu's mind stirred and he inexplicably sensed something. He pushed open the window and looked at the vast and empty space. On the stage. The altar was no longer there, but he could still feel the aura it emitted. It was as if, after the sea spirit baptism, he had unknowingly formed a connection with the altar. The carriage didn't approach the main entrance of the royal palace. Rather, it followed the palace walls for a while and then drove in through a small door. He could faintly hear the ringing of a bell, and the inexplicable connection with the altar disappeared with it. At this time, there was another person in the carriage. It was the one who had spoken before. This person cupped his hands together and said, "Honorable Ning, we are in the palace. Please forgive us." Qin Yu nodded. He leaned back in his soft chair and closed his eyes. The sound of the window closing echoed in his ears. They walked and stopped. The inspection was strict. After an hour, the carriage finally stopped. "Honorable Ning, please." Qin Yu pushed open the door and stepped out. In front of him was a large blue residence. It was so deep that it almost seemed black. The main entrance wasn't ostentatious and even seemed a bit cramped, but it was filled with an imposing aura. Qin Yu looked around. This style of residence was actually quite different from the gorgeous and curvaceous architectural style of the sea race capital city. The outside of the residence seemed normal, but after his soul soared, he could still feel a faint aura. It was silent like a mountain, but once it erupted, it could tear everything to shreds. It was clear that this place wasn't as simple as it seemed on the surface. "Grandmaster Ning, Soup Man has been waiting for a long time. I cannot enter without permission, so I can only send you here." His voice was calm and respectful. Qin Yu nodded. He walked to the front of the residence. As if the residents had expected his arrival, the simple and heavy doors quietly opened. Qin Yu's eyes fell on the courtyard. His eyebrows shot up and surprise flashed in his eyes. Of course, it was only for an instant before he returned to normal. He walked into this unexpected mansion. That's right, it was a mansion. This was the only word that could describe it. Moreover, it was the most luxurious residence that Qin Yu had ever seen in his life. Gold bricks paved the ground. Gold stones piled up into mountains. Gold bars inlaid into the corners as decorations. As far as the eye could see, it was all gold. Countless treasures dotted the area, emitting a halo of light that reflected off the golden light, making it even more dazzling. Gold and silver circulated in the mortal world, similar to spirit stones circulating in cultivators. But in the end, they weren't spirit stones, so cultivators rarely placed them in their eyes. But he never imagined that this soup man would have such strange hobbies. But the dazzling golden light filled his eyes and he couldn't help but admit that he was filled with a heroic spirit, thick and sticky to the touch. Naturally, he was truly wealthy. Disregarding the gold, just the sea treasures that were used as decorations were all extremely expensive. In the final moments of the sea spirit teacher competition, Qin Yu's thoughts stirred and he took away Wu Zetian and a massive number of sea races spirit stones. He originally thought he was rich, but only now did he truly understand what it meant to be the pinnacle of wealth. He had no idea who this soup man was, but he actually had such terrifying wealth. As he thought of this, his eyes changed, revealing a bit of shock and praise. "Honorable Ning, there is no need to be envious. I look at these things every day and use them, but the truth is that none of them belong to me." Soup Man smiled as he walked forwards. He wore loose robes and looked like a rich country lord. He patted a pure gold beast head beside him and said, "Everything here belongs to His Majesty. I fear that the only thing that truly belongs to me is this gold." His tone changed. "Honorable Ning, what do you think of this gold? I was born with a natural liking for this sort of thing." Qin Yu looked at it and said, "It's quite nice." Soup Man suddenly laughed. Every time a guest comes, they don't dare to say anything on the surface, but I fear they find it strange in their hearts. I have also asked them this question, but all I get in return is a pile of flattering nonsense. In truth, it's just as Honorable Ning said, it's just nice to look at. It seems that Honorable Ning and I have a bit of fate together. If there is a chance in the future, we should get closer. However, the reason I asked Honorable Ning to come here today is because there is a troublesome matter. I hope that Grandmaster Ning will do his best. Like this, without warning, he entered the main topic. Facing Soupman's bright eyes, Qin Yu nodded. All right. Soupman beckoned with his hand. The two of them walked to a round table beneath the purple coral and sat down. Of course, this table and chairs were carefully crafted from pure gold. He took out a wooden box from his chest and placed it on the table. Honorable Ning, please take a look first. Qin Yu took the jade box and opened it. Inside was some nutrient fluid that maintained its activity. Floating on the surface was something similar to a tree root. Its skin was slightly withered and it seemed ordinary, but the aura it contained caused Qin Yu's heart to shake and a dignified expression to appear on his face. When it came to sea spirits, he naturally didn't understand them. But, after his soul became more powerful, his senses had become much sharper. Although it was only a short section, Qin Yu could still feel an incomparably tyrannical strength that looked down upon the heavens and earth. It was extremely small, but it was still impossible to ignore. Qin Yu picked it up with both hands and carefully observed it. Then, he put it back and thought for a long time. He said, Soupman, what request do you have? Soupman nodded in satisfaction at Qin Yu's tactful response. I believe that Honorable Ning already has a plan in mind. I would like to ask if Honorable Ning has the confidence to restore this thing's vitality. Qin Yu was silent. Restoring vitality wasn't difficult. What was difficult was that this sea spirit seemed to have absorbed far too much tyrannical strength. It was originally formidable and could transform this tyrannical strength. But, there was far too much of it and it had surpassed the limits of what it could withstand. Simply restoring vitality was only treating the symptoms and not the root cause. Soon, it would be destroyed by the tyrannical strength. The only solution was to enhance the sea spirit's strength and make it more formidable. Only then would it be able to contain the tyrannical strength it absorbed. To be able to absorb and transform such a potent and tyrannical strength, one could imagine the quality of this sea spirit. Wanting to increase its strength would naturally be incomparably difficult. Soupman smiled. If Honorable Ning has any request, I will satisfy it. I ask that Honorable Ning give it a try. These words clearly indicated that he wasn't prepared to refuse. Qin Yu slowly said, I will do my best. Thank you, Honorable Ning. Soupman stood up. I will send you over. After passing through a shining golden corridor, a transmission array appeared. Soupman took out a jade card and it gradually lit up. As they stepped into it, violent fluctuations spread out. Space twisted and the two of them vanished from sight. After several breaths of time, everything in front of them was restored. All they saw was darkness, as if a torch was burning beneath the earth, but it still couldn't disperse the darkness. Across from them, there was a giant stone door that was tightly shut. Countless strange runes were carved into it, flickering like stars. With just a single glance, one's breath quickened and their chests tightened. It was like a peerless vicious beast was being suppressed behind this stone door. Soupman's smile didn't change. He stepped out from the array formation and pointed a finger. Honorable Ning, the sea spirit is behind this stone door. Please prepare yourself. He lifted a hand and pointed at the void. Layers of ripples spread out, falling onto the stone door as if they were knocking. After a series of dull thumping sounds, the runes on the surface lit up and the stone door slowly shook open. Chapter 162. Bang! At this moment, it was like an invisible raging river rushed out from the stone door. Qin Yu's breath caught in his throat. Before his black robes could even flutter, they were pressed against his body. The violent aura roiled like numerous large millstones that surged and revolved without end, and they simply intended to crush one into pieces. Superman had a calm expression, covering up the worry that flashed in his eyes. He turned and smiled. Honorable Ning, there shouldn't be any problems, right? In truth, Qin Yu's first thought just now was that he had already been exposed. But as he thought about it, he realized that if they really wanted to kill him, there was no need to go through so much trouble. As he listened to the light voice, Qin Yu's lips moved. He struggled to suppress the urge to greet Superman's family. Just standing outside the door, the aura was already so terrifying. It could be imagined just how terrifying it would be after entering. Qin Yu's cultivation wasn't weak and his demon body could be considered powerful. But, he didn't have the slightest thought of entering. So, he thought for a moment and said in a soft voice, "What if there's a problem?" Superman brightly smiled. "If there's a problem, you must try to overcome it. Young people must bravely move forwards. Moreover, I believe that with Honorable Ning's strength, you won't disappoint me." He slapped his forehead. "I almost forgot. After Honorable Ning enters, you can only rely on your own strength to resist. You absolutely cannot borrow anything else, otherwise it will be very troublesome." As for how troublesome it would be, Superman didn't say. But, looking at his bright smile, it couldn't be small. Qin Yu had failed. He cursed in his heart and then turned around, smiling and nodding. He took a deep breath and stepped towards the stone door. He felt as if he were going against the current. A powerful strength constantly impacted his body, but it was separated and flowed away. Standing at the door, Qin Yu took a deep breath and stepped in. Then, the feeling suddenly changed. It was like he had fallen from a raging river into a raging sea. The tumbling waves carried with them a strength that could destroy all. Qin Yu stuffily coughed and his face paled. Behind him, the stone door quietly closed. Everything in front of him was dark. Outside the stone door, Superman's smile faded. After a long period of silence, he revealed a self-deprecating smile. I really feel sorry for my mother and the others. I've been gone for so long and yet people still mention me. But, there's nothing I can do about it. Isn't there an old saying that the sea races are helpless in the sea?" He fell silent once more. His eyes gradually turned dignified. He whispered, "Honorable Ning, you can curse me however you like. But I really have to trouble you." The main hall of the royal palace was empty. On the dragon throne, the sea sovereign had an indifferent expression. He looked out the window, his expression calm and leisurely. "Your Majesty, Superman has sent Honorable Ning in." "Yes. Your Majesty." The voice sounded again, heavy and helpless, but also trembling a bit. The sea sovereign looked away. "This solitude knows that you are all worried, but this isn't something that can be solved just by worrying." He smiled. "If worrying can save my life, then what's the harm in crying to the heavens? But, in the end, it's useless. I know, but the situation is extremely dangerous. Does your Majesty not have any arrangements?" The sea sovereign lightly said, "Everything has happened too suddenly. This solitude and all of you weren't prepared, but even so, there is no need to panic. After all, this day will eventually come. I know it, and you know it too. I've already arranged everything that needs to be done. If it's too late, just do as I say." "Yes. Your Majesty. The voice fell silent. The sea sovereign sighed. He was a bit helpless, a bit sad, but even more calm. He had lived for a long, long time, far longer than any living being in this world. He had climbed to the peak of authority and had enjoyed everything he could. In truth, he didn't have any regrets in death. It was just that he was a bit unwilling in his heart. Honorable Ning, thinking of the sea, the spiritual baptism lasted for nearly 10 hours. A trace of anticipation flashed in the depths of his eyes, but he soon calmed down. The darkness was so dark that one couldn't see their fingers. It was like the world's thickest ink. An extremely wild strength crazily attacked him from all directions. In such an environment, those with a weak will wouldn't be able to last too long before their minds collapsed. Bang, bang, a muffled sound rang out clearly. It wasn't that he heard it with his ears, but that strength from the outside bombarded his body, passing through his flesh and bones. Qin Yu coughed and spat out a mouthful of blood, his chest feeling much better. The wild strength behind the stone door completely cut off his senses. He couldn't tell left from right, so he could only move forwards towards the source of the wild strength. But the closer he got to the source, the stronger the strength became. At first he was able to resist it, but now he was gradually being injured. The road ahead was dark and he couldn't see the end. If things continued like this, he didn't know how long he could last. However, Qin Yu wasn't too worried. Old C had said that no one would dare to casually move against him with his current status before he was exposed, so he wasn't being perfunctory. So, since Soup Man had sent him in, he should be safe with his strength. He steadied his feet and withstood the wild bombardment. Qin Yu gasped for breath for a moment before continuing forwards. 2 hours. 4 hours. 6 hours. In the blink of an eye, a day passed. In the grand hall, the sea sovereign shook his head and gently sighed. It seemed that he had been overthinking things. The great Tao was truly ruthless. Since he was doomed to die here, there would be no leeway. Even though he knew he would die, this ruler of the highest authority in the world didn't panic or feel fear. Instead, he revealed a happy smile. This was because even when facing the world, he had still managed to last for so many years. Thinking of this, even with his status, he couldn't help but feel proud. Outside the stone door, Supman's complexion paled. He mumbled to himself, "How could this be? How could this be?" Suddenly, his eyes widened and he began to violently cough. But he couldn't care about this. He took out a black spirit shell from his chest and struck it out. Cough, cough, cough. Your Majesty, the companion vines, strength, cough, 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 has there been any change? Supman's voice echoed through the grand hall. Sitting on the dragon throne, the supreme sea sovereign suddenly stiffened. But in the next moment, he returned to normal. His voice was calm and dignified. It is slightly stronger than before. Supman's round face twisted, as if he were about to cry. What sort of cultivation did His Majesty have? Although his senses were only slightly stronger, the true situation was likely several times stronger. According to the information he had obtained, Honorable Ning should have been able to safely arrive, but now it seemed, the grand hall was deathly silent. Those that had the qualifications to speak with His Majesty all held spirit shells in their hands, their complexions deathly pale. Suddenly, an angry roar echoed out. Soup Man, you have harmed His Majesty, you have harmed His Majesty. Their final hope, and also their most likely hope, had been destroyed in front of their eyes. Even the most important minister of the sea races couldn't withstand such a dramatic contrast. He lost his voice and roared out loud. Soup Man froze in place. That's right, His Majesty wasn't in a good state right now, so he could be forgiven for his negligence. But how could he not have discovered that the companion vine's strength had increased? He looked up at the closed stone door and suddenly reached out a hand. A rune flew out from the stone door, twisting as it fell into his hand. Heaven shrouding symbol, it is actually a heaven shrouding symbol. Your Majesty, this old servant has let you down, I have let you down. Soupman fell to his knees and wailed. This schemer in the eyes of the outside world, this terrifying money grubber, was like a sad child at this time, tears streaming down his face. The roars of questioning came to an abrupt end. No one thought that there would be someone who had reached out to His Majesty. His hand had reached there and he had even arranged everything ahead of time to push His Majesty into a dead end. This matter was Soupman's negligence. But, all of them had the qualifications to reach the stone door and had gone there more than once, but none of them had discovered anything. Strictly speaking, everyone was in the wrong. Your Majesty, please punish us. Sitting on the dragon throne, the sea sovereign frowned. This was the same expression he had when he heard the words heaven shrouding symbol. At this time, he seemed to wake up. He faintly smiled and said, "Stand up. This isn't your fault. After all, who could have imagined this?" He looked up at the entrance of the hall, his eyes as deep as an abyss. When the dynasty changed in the past, this solitude protected them with everything I had. Now, it seems that they only have themselves to blame, otherwise they wouldn't have suffered such a backlash. In the end, this solitude was far too arrogant. I never thought that he would be able to arrange things to this degree. Soupman stood up, tears still streaming down his face. A terrifying aura surged around him. He turned and walked out, following the direction of the burning torches, his steps heavy. Puff, puff, heads exploded one after another. Blood splashed onto the stone walls and the ground. Horrified screams filled the air as countless people fell into pools of their own blood. The slaughter continued. The sound of the spirit shell was clearly transmitted into the hall. But, whether it was the sea sovereign or the other high officials, all of them maintained their calm. For something like this to occur, there had to be traitors within. In order to prevent news of this from spreading out and to buy time to arrange things, they could only use such cruel methods to wash everyone in blood. In truth, the one who felt the most pain was Soupman. After all, the guards were all direct descendants that he had personally raised. After a long time, there was a final miserable scream. Soupman fell to his knees and lifted his hand to strike the point between his eyebrows. Bang! The void shook and he was sent flying backwards. He tumbled several times, his appearance extremely distressed. He cried out, "Your Majesty, why did you save me? Let this old servant die. Only by dying can my pain be alleviated." In the hall, the sea sovereign drew back his hand. He frowned as if he were enduring something. He slowly said, "You old thing, you should know just how difficult it was for this solitude to take action. If you don't want me to immediately die, then shut up and wait for my arrangements. It's not your fault, and it's not time for you to die yet. I want you to assist the new king in stabilizing his rule after I return to heaven." Soupman fell to his knees. "This old servant is willing to sacrifice his life for you. Your Majesty, please instruct us." The sea sovereign was silent for several breaths of time. Then, his cold and callous voice echoed through the hall. "Summon all princes and princesses into the palace, no one is allowed to be absent. Summon the generals of the legions to immediately enter the palace to receive orders. Summon the storms of the 8 directions to draft the document of succession. Summon the turtle Great Dipper to enter the palace to wait upon the emperor." An awe-inspiring aura flowed through the main hall. The air suddenly became cold, as if it was about to freeze. This ruler of the sea tribes that had been silent for so many years, in the final moments of his life, was finally going to bare his fangs and erase all the factors that tried to shake his rule. Order the Dark Knight Division to start the execution process. My time is limited, so don't interrogate me. Within a day, I want the blood of the 36 cities in the royal capital to cover the earth. It stopped abruptly. His Majesty, who was cold and murderous, and whose momentum was gradually rising, froze on the spot, extremely stunned. Your Majesty! Your Majesty, what's wrong? Don't scare this old servant. Your Majesty, wake up. After a brief silence, Superman and the others cried out in sorrow. Their robes were instantly soaked in a cold sweat. If His Majesty really died, then in the blink of an eye, monstrous waves would rise. This solitude is fine. These words were like heaven and hell. All of the high officials nearly wept tears of joy. Your Majesty, please don't be like this again. There might be a chance for things to turn for the better. These words echoed throughout the hall. The sea sovereign had a strange complexion. After a long period of silence, he said, "The previous orders, temporarily revoke." Chapter 163. The darkness was like a quagmire, wrapping around one with layers upon layers. If one fell deep within, they would be powerless to struggle. In the end, they would be swallowed up and reduced to bones. No, perhaps they would be crushed bones. After all, such a tyrannical strength was enough to crush a corpse into countless pieces. As Chin-Yu thought of such a tragic fate, he gasped for breath. He clenched his teeth and squeezed out from the darkness. Then, he slumped to the ground, his chest heaving up and down like a bellows. He thought that Old C's words weren't truthful and that Superman was nothing at all. He cursed and roared inwardly. After a long time, he recovered some of his strength. He stood up in the dim light and looked in front of him. The massive underground space was covered with vines. They were thick beyond imagination, and the parts that occasionally rose up were like ancient trees that towered into the heavens. Countless roots grew out from the vines, drilling into the earth and absorbing nutrients. But it was impossible for it to grow to such a scale just by relying on this. The corners of Chin-Yu's lips twitched. The root-like object that Superman had given him really came from here. It was really difficult for that old thing to find such a small part of such a massive object. Bang! With a loud explosion, the thick vines in the distance exploded. A wild and tyrannical strength surged outwards, tearing apart everything around it and sending leaves flying everywhere. The explosion caused a chain reaction. Several more small-scale explosions occurred. The vines wriggled like living creatures, rapidly growing. After several breaths of time, all traces of the explosion vanished from sight. The broken branches and leaves were covered up and absorbed, as if that scene just now had been nothing but an illusion. But in the end, it wasn't an illusion. Chin-Yu's complexion paled. If he had been caught in that explosion, even if his demon body was powerful, he feared he would have been blown to pieces. Superman, you old bastard. Of course, Chin-Yu could guess that this matter didn't have much to do with Superman. But, he couldn't defend that person, so he could only vent his resentment on him. Now, these vines were filled with a tyrannical strength. They were like unstable volcanoes. Any external stimulation, such as a collision or stepping on them, could cause them to explode. He looked up at the dense jungle of vines. Chin-Yu made up his mind that he absolutely wouldn't step in. But if he didn't do anything, even if he left here, the royal palace wouldn't give up. Chin-Yu hesitated and then bitterly smiled. Whatever, he might as well give it a try. Otherwise, that old bastard Superman might just let him fend for himself here. His divine consciousness broke out of his body and carefully scanned the surroundings. Finding nothing out of the ordinary, he took out the silent stone and placed it in his palm. Then, with a flip of his hand, a foot and 2 inches of sea blue unfurled. A deep blue light shined down on one of the branches of the vine. It slightly trembled, and just as Chinyu was about to erupt with strength and retreat, the vine actually retreated on its own initiative. Then, like flowing water, countless vines gave way, revealing a straight path that led deep into the forest. Chinyu revealed a look of surprise. He never thought that this vine would have a basic consciousness of its own and be able to feel the little blue lamp's strength. Was it moving aside so that he could reach the root and save it? His face was cloudy and uncertain. After a long time, he took a deep breath and strode forwards. Of course, he was already prepared. If anything went wrong, he could immediately use the blood escape. Luckily, the vines seemed to know that this was a matter of life and death. Occasionally there would be explosions, but they were covered up by the layers of leaves and branches, not affecting Chinyu at all. The journey was smooth. But Chinyu was still secretly startled. The underground space was far larger than he had imagined. Naturally, the volume of the vine was even more terrifying. Finally, a large black stone appeared in his line of sight. It was so large that it might be more appropriate to call it a small mountain. Layers upon layers of twisted roots wrapped around the black stone. All of the vines extended out from here. It was clear that this was where the main root was located. Chinyu was secretly shocked. He found it hard to believe that these vines were actually multiplied from a single plant. But the exposed roots were cracked and withered, each one brimming with the aura of time. It was clear that they had existed for an extremely long period of time. Thinking for a moment, Chinyu walked over to the black stone. He opened his palm and allowed the light of the little blue lamp to shine onto a thick root. Although he was well aware that the little blue lamp had an unimaginable effect on the growth of sea spirits, the scene in front of him still left him frightened. Beneath the deep blue light, the roots suddenly trembled and began to thicken at a speed visible to the naked eye. The dry skin on its surface began to break apart and fall off. In several breaths of time, the root nearly doubled in size. Even the surrounding roots began to wriggle and grow. On the mountain-like black stone, the twisted roots twisted as if they were alive. This scene was particularly strange and caused a chill to rise from the depths of one's heart. Five fingers came together and the blue light was completely covered up. Chinyu's eyes were dignified. Rumble rumble, with a loud rumbling sound, the entire underground space shook. The thick vines seemed to angrily tumble about. But what happened next was unexpected. A vine as thick as an arm drilled out, bringing a black fruit in front of him. The fruit was the size of a child's fist and there was a hard shell on its surface. Smelling it carefully, there seemed to be a light fragrance coming from it. Chinyu had a strange expression. What was the meaning of this? Did it want to make a deal with him? Thinking for a moment, he reached out and plucked the fruit. As he sensed it, he revealed a shocked expression. This common-looking black fruit actually contained an extremely formidable strength. It could be called a small bomb. However, the strength within was extremely stable and in some sort of delicate balance. It seemed, it could be absorbed. Of course, if one were to directly pour in magic power and break the balance within, the black fruit would immediately transform into a truly terrifying bomb. The vine continued to tumble about, as if it were saying, "Take my things and hurry up and give me the blue light, otherwise I'm going to get angry." Chinyu's eyes flashed. He slowly said, "You should be able to understand. I can help you, but just one of these fruits isn't enough." Whoosh, whoosh, with the sound of breaking air, 10 vines burst out, each one with a fruit growing on it. As expected, it was quite tactful. The night passed. When the little blue lamp restrained its light, there were now 36 black fruits in Chinyu's storage ring. This seemed to be everything, or perhaps it was the vine's bottom line. No matter what Chinyu said, he wasn't able to obtain more. Of course, its efforts weren't without returns. The black stone could no longer be seen as it was completely wrapped up in countless vines. They had all doubled in size, and the vines that were directly illuminated by the little blue lamp were so thick that it would take several people to wrap their arms around them. The color of the vines seemed to be cast from steel. Rumble, rumble, the branches and leaves of the vine were trembling. Although there weren't many changes on the surface, the insides were constantly rising, becoming more tenacious and possessing an even greater ability to withstand pain. The tyrannical strength that filled the vines was completely sealed away. Although this didn't completely solve the problem, there shouldn't be any more problems for a considerable period of time. Qin Yu put away the little blue lamp. He lightly said, "I have fulfilled my promise. It's time for me to leave." Bang! The vine erupted, shooting out from all directions. In the blink of an eye, it wove together into a giant cage that sealed Qin Yu within. He frowned, but his complexion didn't change. "Believe me, if I have a way to save you, I can also destroy you. Our transaction ends here today. When you can take out more black fruits, I will come again. Of course, you can choose not to believe me, but you only have one chance." There was a long period of silence. The vine seemed to be deep in thought, but it might also be ignoring him. Qin Yu's aura gradually turned cold. He lifted his palm and a pill appeared. It was a dark green color, like the color of plants that were about to die, but not yet dead. Qin Yu's voice was calm and cold. "This pill came from a human cultivator alchemist. Its name is 100-Mile Lonely. This pill doesn't have much use. The only thing it can do is infect spiritual plants. As long as you come into contact with them, the poison will constantly replicate and regenerate, unstoppable. Oh, perhaps I can give you an example. For instance, use it here. As long as I crush this pill and stimulate it, you will soon feel discomfort. Then, this discomfort will rapidly spread until you can't breathe. Gradually, you will feel a stabbing pain as if you are being cut by a knife. Gradually, you will rot into thick liquid and finally fall to the ground. Before you die, you might be able to kill me. But believe me, you will also die. You will definitely die." This pill came from the poison Grandmaster Daoist Wu Yuan, so its effects weren't too exaggerated. After all, if he didn't have some hidden cards, he wouldn't have dared to take out the little blue lamp to save this vine that had clearly developed a consciousness of its own. The vine responded. The vines that wove together into a net began to rub against each other, emitting a deep sound. As they collided in midair, they formed strange syllables. "You keep your word." Beneath the black robe, his eyes were cold. "If I say it, you can choose not to believe me." "All right." The vine retreated, revealing a path. Qin Yu took several steps forward and stopped. "Concerning today's matters, I do not wish for anyone else to know. Otherwise, the agreement between us will be nullified." He didn't look back. His steps weren't fast, as if everything was within his control. As he walked further and further away, his figure was gradually swallowed up by the darkness. Whoosh! There was the sound of breaking air. Qin Yu stopped, tightly grasping the poison pill in his hand. He had no choice but to save the vine, otherwise the royal palace wouldn't let this matter rest. Thus, Qin Yu knew that there might be trouble ahead, so he still took action. But if he really couldn't retreat, he didn't lack the courage to risk his life. Whoosh! The darkness was torn apart. A thick vine stopped in front of him. Its surface emitted a faint light as it fell to the ground. Qin Yu thought for a moment and then stepped onto the vine. The tyrannical strength that rushed at him disappeared as if it were shielded from sight. The vine shuttled through the darkness, rushing towards the entrance. Qin Yu's taut heart relaxed a little. As he thought, this vine had enough intelligence to judge his situation. It was fine right now, but the tyrannical strength it absorbed continued to increase. Like a reinforced dam, the water became increasingly wild and violent until it couldn't hold on any longer. Qin Yu was the only person that could save it. So, it used this action to repair its previous actions and express its goodwill. That was enough. ######. The stock of manuscripts was exhausted, the child was in all sorts of situations, and in addition, he had to sort out the outline. Chapter 164. The vine was extremely fast. Even though it was difficult to pass through, it was now exceptionally fast. After a moment, the stone door appeared in sight. As if it were imprisoned, the vine stopped in the distance and fell to the ground. Qin Yu walked down and looked up at it. The vine hadn't left, so it must have some other reason. Since it had sent him here, it shouldn't have any ill intentions, so his eyes were calm. After several breaths of silence, the end of the vine suddenly split open and a thin black crystal chip spat out. Qin Yu's eyes flashed. He didn't sense any ill intentions. After a moment of hesitation, he reached out and took the crystal chip. But at this time, his complexion changed. This was because the black crystal chip melted as soon as it touched his flesh and blood and drilled into his flesh. The chill in his eyes brightened. But in the next moment, he was startled. He thoughtfully looked at the vine and closed his eyes, feeling the memories that had appeared in his soul. These memories were strange syllables. They weren't complete and Qin Yu didn't understand their meaning. But as he looked through them, he felt his heart tremble. It was like there was an invisible majesty that caused his soul to shiver and instinctively feel awe. But soon, Qin Yu discovered that this wasn't just because of awe, but because something was about to gush out from his soul. A sea chart unfurled above his head. Islands dotted the rolling waves. At this time, light gushed out from the islands, as if they were starry skies. These syllables surged in his soul, gradually turning into an impulse. So, Qin Yu lifted a hand. After a moment of hesitation, he pointed somewhere in the sea. There was a loud ringing sound. The light of the islands on the sea chart instantly vanished from sight. It seemed as if it had been drawn out and exhausted. There was a brief dizziness in his mind. Then, as his mind cleared, a picture scroll appeared in front of him. In the boundless sea, a great sun hung high in the sky. The waves were calm and gentle. Sunlight sprinkled down, reflecting off the sparkling waves. This was rare good weather. There were large ships sailing on the sea. Men who had been tanned by the sun and the sea wind were shouting and working together to pull up fishing nets. As they looked at the fish that had been dumped onto the deck, they grinned, revealing mouthfuls of white teeth. At this time, beneath the great sun in the skies, space suddenly twisted and was broken from within. A beam of light fell straight down, blasting into the sea, directly piercing through the seawater, forming a bottomless hole. The surrounding seawater was pushed away, unable to fill the empty space. Thus, the hole grew larger and larger, reaching a shocking length of several hundred feet. A terrifying shock wave spread outwards, stirring up countless amounts of seawater. Giant wolves covered the sky. In the blink of an eye, the beautiful weather had transformed into the arrival of doomsday. On the big ship, the fishermen were overturned and fell to the ground. Their faces were full of fear, and they held on to the things around them tightly while praying with pale faces. A muscular man who seemed to be the commander struggled to support his body and shouted something loudly, as if he was commanding everyone to dodge. Suddenly, another huge wave struck, causing the ship to shake violently. A sea turtle flew out from the sea and ruthlessly smashed into the man's head, causing blood to gush out. The scroll stopped abruptly. There was another brief period of dizziness before it scattered. Qin Yu opened his eyes, his expression grim. Taking a closer look, Zhang Xian realized that there was nothing wrong with his body at all. With a thought, the sea map appeared once more. However, the glowing islands had already returned to normal. Was what he saw just now an illusion? It should be. Perhaps it was because of those strange syllables. Looking at the vine in front of him, perhaps it wanted to use this to move Qinyu. Unfortunately, if there wasn't an accident, he wouldn't come here again. Qinyu didn't feel any guilt in his heart. He cupped his hands together and lightly said, "Farewell." Rumble, the vine rapidly retreated, vanishing from sight in the blink of an eye. Qinyu walked in front of the stone door. As he hesitated, unsure what to do, the stone door seemed to sense his aura and slowly opened. Superman stood in front of the door, a bit surprised, but even more excited. He cupped his hands together and said, "Honorable Ning, I owe you a favor today. I will repay you in the future." Qinyu walked out. As he heard the stone door close, he bitterly smiled. "Superman, I hope that you never look for me again. I know that Honorable Ning was wrong today, but please believe that everything you have done will be repaid in the future." Superman smiled, as if he were implying something. "I think that Honorable Ning doesn't have a good impression of this place right now. Then I will lead you away." Qinyu nodded. As he walked towards the transmission array, he could smell the scent of blood in the air that hadn't yet dispersed. A cold light flashed in his eyes, but his complexion didn't change and he didn't ask anything. The transmission array flashed and the two of them vanished from sight. When they reappeared, they were already in that glorious and magnificent mansion. There were 4 beautiful sea folk women standing there, each of them holding a tray covered with a red cloth. It was unknown what was inside. Superman's smile was a bit forced. He lifted a finger and said, "Honorable Ning, choose one. Consider it my thanks for today." Qinyu didn't intend to refuse. He swept his eyes around and pointed to the leftmost sea folk woman. "That one." Superman's eyes twitched. "Ning. Honorable Ning, you have good eyesight." He waved his hand and ordered the other 3 sea folk women to bow and draw back. Then, he removed the cloth covering the tray. Within the translucent crystal box was a thumb-sized bead. Within this bead was the phantom of a great snake roaring into the heavens. In this crystal box is the inner core of a deep-sea snake monster. Because it refused to accept the rule of the capital city, it was suppressed and killed 30 years ago. This snake monster's cultivation has reached an extremely profound level and it has touched upon the edge of transforming into a flood dragon. If it were to succeed, it would be able to roam the vast sea region and wouldn't be so easy to kill. Superman took a deep breath. He moved his eyes away with difficulty and waved his hand. Take it, take it. It's yours now." Qinyu had a helpless expression. He thought that there was probably no one else who could give such a thank you gift. Of course, he wouldn't refuse it. From Superman's complexion, he could see just how precious this snake monster's inner core was. It was absolutely at the nascent soul realm. Although he hadn't figured out what to do with the inner core, he might as well accept it for now. Superman helplessly watched as Qinyu reached out his hand and flipped it over. Then, the crystal box containing the inner core vanished from sight. His heart ached so much that he couldn't breathe. His face paled and he weakly waved his hand. "You can leave." He didn't say the following words, but Qinyu could already guess what he meant. It was, "Before I regret this." This Superman was indeed as the rumors said, he viewed wealth as his life. Qinyu suddenly rejoiced. Luckily, he had accepted it just now. If he had been a bit more modest, he feared that Superman really would have taken back the inner core. Seeing Superman's joyous face twist up in pain, Qinyu cupped his hands across his chest and walked away. He didn't want to stay in the royal palace for too long to begin with, much less in this sort of situation. Perhaps this old bastard would really regret it later. As he thought, those in a high position always knew how to make good use of people. That lofty and aloof ruler of the sea races had ordered Superman to guard the royal palace's treasury. It would be hard for his wealth not to grow with each passing day. As he thought this, he was actually a bit happy. After all, although he had suffered a bit this time, he had still obtained some harvests. And, most importantly, he hadn't exposed his identity. Even now, Chinyu had only regarded that terrifying underground vine as some formidable strength from within the royal palace. He hadn't associated it with anyone. Otherwise, he would have realized that he had been too optimistic. The doors to the mansion opened and Chinyu stepped out. Before he could smile, he froze. Outside, the sea race man who had received him bowed to the noble one who had just spoken. Then, he turned and walked back. "Grandmaster Ning, I will escort you back." He seemed to have a faint idea of what was going on and his tone became a bit more respectful. Chinyu nodded. He looked straight ahead as he boarded the carriage. After several breaths of time, it began to slowly move away. The noble one outside the mansion was a beautiful young girl. Between her eyebrows was a delicate scale. Her name was High Flourishing Qian, the Sea of the Sea, and Flourishing Qian. "Princess, Superman invites you in." A maid ran out and respectfully said. The princess nodded. She took several steps towards the mansion and then stopped. She looked at the carriage that was gradually moving away and turned around, her eyebrows furrowing together. After thinking for a moment, she turned and whispered something into the ears of the maid next to her. The maid revealed an awkward expression. The princess had a light expression. "I didn't ask you to do anything. I was just a bit curious." The maid who was familiar with the princess rolled her eyes inwardly. She thought that her words were quite meaningless, but since she had spoken, she had no choice but to do it. She respectfully bowed and hurried away. She thought that she would have to make proper arrangements and not stir up any trouble. The carriage drove out of the royal palace. As it walked through the streets of the capital city, the faint sound Shell Station's voice drifted in through the half-closed windows. According to news from this station, the array symbol noble family, the Southern River Mansion, has been placed under investigation by the tax division for suspected tax evasion. At this time, the Southern River Mansion has been closed down and all those involved have been taken away. It is reported that the Southern River Mansion has committed a massive amount of tax evasion and will face severe punishment. We will continue to pay attention to the follow-up news. The latest and fastest sound Shell Station, please keep an eye on the Balala Sound Shell Station. The young sea race man in the carriage looked over. He smiled and explained, "This sort of matter happens every year. I just can't figure out why these rich and powerful families would want to evade taxes when they earn a massive amount of wealth every year. I fear they're going to suffer a great deal this time." He didn't gloat at the misfortune of others. Instead, he was calm and had a rare calmness to him. It was quite consistent with his temperament. But this explanation in itself was a bit superfluous. Thus, no matter how calm and natural he appeared, it could only be a cover-up. Chinyu thought back to the smell of blood he had smelled when he left the underground space. Although it had been cleaned up, it was still very rich. There should have been many people who died. He nodded. Beneath his black robes, there was no expression at all. He didn't want to be involved in the internal affairs of the sea races, especially when it involved that dangerous royal palace. Soon, he arrived at Sea Spirit Pavilion. Chapter 165. There were already people waiting outside Sea Spirit Pavilion. Just as Chinyu stepped off the carriage, a group of people walked out to greet him. The one leading them was Chief Manager Wu. Clearwood was also among them. He didn't know if it was an illusion, but when he first saw her, he felt as if a great burden had been lifted from her shoulders. Besides these familiar people, there was also a man and a woman. They had extraordinary bearings and were elegant and noble. Looking at the cautious young man and woman behind them, it wasn't hard to guess who they were. He nodded in greeting. This wasn't the place to speak. Chief Manager Wu smiled and tactfully stepped to the side. The Qing family patriarch's tone was warm and polite. "Greetings, Honorable Ning." The wise and virtuous madam only gently smiled and bowed, leaving all attention to her husband. Qin Yu cupped his hands together. "Qing family patriarch, there is no need to be so courteous. I already had the intention of paying a visit a long time ago, but there were too many matters to attend to, so I was delayed." The Qing family patriarch smiled. "Honorable Ning is too serious. It is my wife and I who have come to pay a visit." These words weren't too excessive. Noble Court Avenue was the capital city and was a small part of the peak of power. Even so, there were still 37 families living here. The Qing family was only one of them. Moreover, they were in decline and no longer had the prestige of the past. As for Honorable Ning, he was ranked third of the 10 great purple cards and was also a legendary spiritual bestower. His sea spirit baptism had lasted for nearly 10 hours and was unprecedented. And more importantly, his sudden rise had no foundation at all. All the masters of the houses on Noble Court Avenue were trying their best to establish a relationship with him. If they could meet, then let alone personally, they would even bring a group of little sisters and daughters and let Honorable Ning choose from them. From the end of the sea spirit baptism until now, the Qing family had received many vague greetings. All of them wanted to have a chance to speak with Honorable Ning through them. The conditions they offered were extremely tempting, but they were all rejected without exception. Although the Qing family didn't have anyone with great wisdom or courage, as a member of the top circle of nobles, they still had the eyesight and judgment. After exchanging some pleasantries, Qin Yu could be considered the host. He invited the family into Sea Spirit Pavilion. The 7th floor was the workshop, but it was also built as a place to receive guests and live. Qin Yu had come here several times before, but now there were changes. Although it wasn't too obvious, the style and quality had clearly risen by more than a level. It was clear that after the competition ended, Chief Manager Wu had ordered people to quietly modify it. Qin Yu didn't care too much about this. He invited everyone to take a seat and a maid brought tea and snacks. His eyes swept over them with excitement, burning like a pair of small hooks. Thinking about it, if Honorable Ning had any interest during his break, she certainly wouldn't refuse. After chatting for a while, they got down to business. The Qing family patriarch coughed and said, "Honorable Ning, Lian and my daughter Qingqing love each other. My wife and I both approve of this. Now, the two of them are no longer young and it is time for them to start a family. I wonder if Honorable Ning has any objections to this." The two young men in the corner instantly became the focus of everyone's attention. Being surrounded by the crowd, their faces flushed red. Qin Yu smiled. "If I say I don't approve of this matter, I fear Lian will betray the sect." His words caused Lian's face to turn red. He wanted to say something, but he couldn't. There was a trace of awkwardness, but there was even more joy. His teacher was joking with him to express their closeness. He feared that other people weren't enough for his teacher to have such thoughts. The Qing family patriarch smiled. "Since that's the case, I wonder if Honorable Ning can preside over their marriage." He tried his best to appear calm, but there was still a trace of nervousness in his eyes. To Lian and the Qing family, whether or not Qin Yu could preside over this marriage represented a completely different meaning. One meant that he had a backer, and the other meant that the situation had changed and his status was shaken. Qingqing already knew the implications of this. She didn't care too much about it. She gently pulled on Leon's sleeves. After hesitating for a moment, he stood up and deeply bowed. "Teacher, if possible, please preside over this disciple's marriage." Chief Manager Wu and Clearwood both smiled as they watched. But what happened next was beyond their expectations. Surprise flashed in their eyes. Beneath the black robes, there was a moment of silence. "I'm afraid it is impossible for me to preside over your marriage." The Qing family patriarch and Madame Qing felt their hearts sink. They forced out a smile. Qing's eyes widened, a bit flustered. Leon's mouth fell open. He stammered, It's this disciple, who was rash. Teacher must have something important." Qing Yu smiled. He waved his hand. "Leon is my only disciple. From the very beginning, I have seen what happened between him and Qing. If the two of them can walk together, I am naturally happy. It's just that there is an extremely important matter to attend to, so I cannot spare the time to attend your wedding. However, as your teacher, I can be considered your elder, so I cannot lack the gifts that should be given to you." He turned around. "Chief Manager, I remember that in the gambling challenge, Wu Zetian placed a bet on a residence in the capital city. Have you obtained it yet?" Chief Manager Wu's heart skipped a beat. He thought of a possibility and couldn't help but look at Leon, envy in his eyes. He respectfully said, "I have already obtained the deed. It is a courtyard that was newly built in recent years and the decorations and furniture inside are nearly unused. It is located on the east side of the capital city near Noble Court Avenue. It is a very good location." Qing Yu nodded. "Then that saves me the trouble. Leon, teacher will gift this residence to you and Qing as a congratulatory gift for your wedding." This amount of money was more than shocking. The Qing family could be considered a great family with a great background, but it was impossible for them to casually gift such a large residence to someone else. It had to be known that with Wu Zetian's status, he had spent dozens of years building this residence. The decorations inside and outside were all top-quality items. Even if it wasn't worth 100 million spirit stones, it wouldn't be much different. The Qing family patriarch and Madame Qing were shocked. They quickly refused, saying that it was impossible for two juniors to be married like this. Leon and Qing also expressed that they didn't dare to accept. Qing Yu smiled and shook his head. "It's just a residence. I fear I won't live in it, and it would be a waste to leave it unused. Leon, what do you think?" Leon was about to refuse when he suddenly remembered that beneath his teacher's black robes was a human. He wasn't an idiot, otherwise it would be impossible for him to possess such a formidable talent as a sea spirit teacher. "Teacher, he might be leaving soon." "Yes, that must be it." Thinking of this, he felt an inexplicable sense of panic and also a bit sad. After hesitating for a while, he pulled Qing to her knees. "Thank you for teacher's generous gift." Qing Yu flicked his sleeves and pulled the two of them up. "Chief Manager, Manager Clearwood, after this seclusion, I might leave the capital city for some time. I ask that you look after Leon." Chief Manager Wu's thoughts stirred. He thought back to what old C had said and knew that Honorable Ning really did have thoughts of leaving the capital city. He nodded. "I ask that Honorable Ning rest assured." Clearwood seemed a bit distracted. She only nodded, not saying much. The Qing family patriarch and Madame Qing were both surprised and happy. They didn't notice anything strange at this moment. Their hearts were filled with excitement and their restlessness had long since faded away. With such a generous gift, even if Honorable Ning couldn't attend the wedding, it was enough to show how much he valued Leon and the Qing family. In the future, as long as they managed things well and maintained their relationship with Grandmaster Ning, it would only be a matter of time before the Qing family rose again. After obtaining a satisfactory answer and learning that Honorable Ning would be in seclusion for some time, the Qing family patriarch and Madame Qing stood up and bid their farewells. Qingqing left with them. The sea races also had similar rules. It wasn't good for a newly married young man and woman to meet in private. Leon stayed behind. He lowered his head slightly and remained silent. Chief Manager Wu thought that Qin Yu knew that Qin Yu was leaving, so he wasn't surprised. He took out 3 storage shells and placed them on the table. Honorable Ning, the first one contains all of the profits you obtained from the gambling challenge. The second is the 20 million spirit stones that Master promised you. There are also some soul-strengthening treasures that are on their way. They will arrive at the capital city in the next few days. The third one is Old C's gift to you. He didn't know when Honorable Ning would leave, so he had to make sure he handed everything over before then. At this time, after handing over the 3 storage shells, he let out a clear breath of relief. During this period of time, he had been trembling with fear while carrying these things. The 4 swordsmen of the sea mantis race could also rest for a while. Qin Yu nodded. He put away the 3 storage shells and casually asked, "Where is Old C?" Clearwood said, "Teacher's injuries have temporarily stabilized, but in order to avoid leaving behind any hidden dangers, he will need to go into seclusion for some time." Just as everyone thought she had finished speaking, this cold woman suddenly said, "Honorable Ning, do you really want to leave?" Chief Manager Wu furrowed his eyebrows. Although everyone had guessed this, it wasn't good to rashly say it out loud. But at this time, as he looked at Clearwood's eyes, he seemed to realize something. A strange expression appeared on his face, and he couldn't bring himself to blame her at all. Qin Yu was startled. He nodded. There was no need to hide this. Perhaps someone as astute as Old C had already guessed something, so he had Chief Manager Wu deliver the gifts to him before he went into seclusion. "Can't I stay?" "I can't." Qin Yu smiled. He earnestly said, "There are some matters that need to be resolved by me. So, although the capital city is good, it is still my hometown." Clearwood's eyes darkened. She nodded, no longer speaking. She and Chief Manager Wu only thought that Qin Yu was speaking about his hometown. Only Leon knew why his teacher had to leave. He was already too dazzling right now. An accident could occur at any moment, especially when an invitation from the royal palace appeared. He was fine this time, but what about next time? What about the next time? There would always be a day when something would happen. As wise and cautious as his teacher was, how could he not see through this? So, he had to leave. After Chief Manager Wu and Clearwood bid their farewells and left, Qin Yu glanced at his unhappy disciple. "All right, I will leave sooner or later. Being able to leave safely is the best result I can hope for. You should be happy for me." Leon's eyes turned red. "Teacher, will we ever meet again?" Qin Yu thought for a moment and then shook his head. "I don't know, but I believe that in the future, Leon, you will definitely become a truly great figure. Brat, you can do it. Qingqing is a good girl, so don't disappoint her. Go, I will be going into seclusion soon. Before I leave, I will see you again." Leon nodded. He respectfully bowed, took several steps back, and left. Qin Yu gently sighed. It wasn't that he was in too much of a hurry, but that the situation was beyond his control. When he left Supman's mansion, he never thought he would run into Princess Lushy. Although he thought his performance was flawless, this girl had already begun to suspect him. That's right, although Princess Lushy appeared calm, the strange light in her eyes didn't escape Qin Yu's notice. With her status, it was easy for her to obtain the recording that had caused such an uproar. Perhaps it couldn't prove anything, but as long as she had some evidence, locking onto his identity was only a matter of time. Thus, Qin Yu couldn't wait any longer. He had to immediately go into seclusion and refine the last of the 5 elements spiritual objects. Before his identity was exposed, he had to leave the sea race capital city. Supman's eyes flashed. If so, then we can't let him go. Of course. Since Honorable Ning has a way to strengthen the companion vine, you cannot take even half a step out of the capital city. This may be unreasonable, but for the sake of His Majesty, I have no choice but to do it. Immediately order people to strictly monitor the situation. I hope that Honorable Ning can understand. The ministers spoke forcefully, and their attitudes were extremely unyielding. In their opinion, as long as they could ensure His Majesty's safety, everything else was nothing. Honorable Ning, his status was indeed extraordinary, but so what? In the depths of the sea, the giant whales shook their bodies, pushing the seawater aside as they moved forward. Each one of them was covered in thick scales. They would occasionally open their mouths, revealing rows of sharp teeth that were as sharp as knives. They would cut up the fish and shrimp that fell into their mouths and swallow them. Killer whales were one of the most ferocious and terrifying races of the sea races. They were innately fond of slaughter. There were very few people that dared to provoke killer whales, much less now that 5 killer whales were gathered together. Their massive bodies cast a shadow that caused countless sea creatures to flee in panic. On the backs of the 5 killer whales, halos of light flowed, separating them from the icy cold seawater. They formed a small enchantment similar to the one in the capital city. The largest killer whale was in the center. Within the enchantment, there were several thousand craft houses. It was unknown how they were fixed, but as they moved forward, they didn't seem to shake at all. An 11 to 12-year-old girl had a pair of deep blue eyes that were as clear and beautiful as the calm sea. At this time, her lips were wrinkled, as if she were bored to death. 7th Auntie, it's too boring to travel. How about we stop for a day and stroll around? Afraid that she would be rejected, she quickly raised her hand. I promise that I will absolutely listen to you and won't cause any trouble. The one called 7th Auntie was a strong woman. She wasn't mistaken, she was a woman. Although using the word strong to describe this woman didn't seem right, it was actually quite appropriate. Her skin was dark and her eyes were wide. Her body was like an iron tower, and she was even sturdier than the guards in the distance. Hearing this, the woman grinned. Little ancestor, how long has it been since that matter from last time? Have you already forgotten? Don't waste your time. There are only several days left until we reach the capital city and I'll agree to whatever you want to play with me, okay? In contrast to her appearance, her gentle and soft voice was an astonishing sight. If one closed their eyes, they would only think of a beautiful woman holding an oil paper umbrella in the misty rain of Jiangnan. As for opening their eyes, forget it, it was better to close them. The young girl was a bit dispirited. She muttered in a low voice, I already said that it was just an accident. Who would have thought that I would be so unlucky? She blinked her eyes, a pitiful expression on her face as she tried to act cute again. Unfortunately, after the last incident, the woman had become a frightened bird. No matter what she said, she didn't seem to be shaken at all. The young girl was sharp-tongued and couldn't refute her. In the end, she could only use something else to dodge the question. Miss, this time we are going to the capital city for official business. You should have heard of Honorable Ning's reputation. The madam has repeatedly reminded me that it wouldn't be good to keep him waiting for too long. The young girl shrunk back, a bitter expression on her face. Since the other party had brought up her mother, there really wasn't any other way. Unfortunately, she had heard that the blue lotuses in this sea region were extremely beautiful scenery. She didn't know when she would have the chance to come here again. As she thought of this, she couldn't help but feel her interest waning. She also felt a bit more dissatisfied with this Grandmaster Ning. No matter how it was said, it was because of this person that she didn't have the chance. Humph humph, this miss will remember this. But after a while, she began to laugh. She felt that her thoughts were far too unreasonable. Moreover, with Honorable Ning's status, he wouldn't fear her at all. On the contrary, she would have to carefully curry favor with him. As she thought of this, it wasn't funny at all. The young girl's face hardened. After a moment of boredom, she suddenly said, "Seventh Auntie, do you think we'll meet that person again?" These words didn't have a beginning or end, but the woman had heard them countless times during this period of time. Calluses had formed in her ears, so she naturally understood. Because she had said that the sea region was endless and that the chances of two sea folk meeting each other again were so low that it was negligible. Her complexion turned solemn and she earnestly said, "If fate wills it, we will meet again." At the same time, if a pair of eyes that soared into the highest heavens were looking down on the earth, they would discover that with the capital city as the origin, in nearly the opposite direction, there was also a group of travel-worn people rushing towards the never-extinguishing underwater sun. They clearly weren't as imposing as the 5 killer whales. The sea wolves beneath them had dim eyes and seemed extremely tired, but they still ran with all their might. On the back of each sea wolf was a knight. There was a knight lying on the ground. He was wearing armor and had an indifferent look in his eyes. A giant shadow swam over from the seabed. Its cruel eyes locked onto the group and it roared as it rushed over. Right at this moment, the figure on the sea wolf's back raised his head and glanced over. Its massive body came to a screeching halt. With a whimper, it turned and fled far away. This wasn't strange at all. This was because the eyes of the sea folk on the back of the sea wolf were far too terrifying. They were as cold as the winter wind, blowing into one's heart and soul, causing one's heartbeat to stop and their blood to freeze. He lifted a hand and the group quickly stopped. The knight sat up straight, their sharp eyes sweeping around as a fierce aura began to spread outwards. Without a doubt, these were the most elite warriors. The leader patted the clearly larger sea wolf beneath him. It turned around and ran a few times until it arrived at the carriage that the 36 wolf riders were guarding. It respectfully said, "Vice Priest, would you like to rest here before continuing on your journey?" He was clearly exhausted, but his eyes were still firm. As long as the person in the carriage refused, he would continue on his way. After several breaths of silence, a calm voice sounded out from the carriage, "Rest for 2 hours." The leader lifted a hand and made a gesture. The 36 wolf riders immediately scattered. Some people dismounted to feed their mounts, some hugged them and fell asleep. Others remained vigilant. "Shuizheng, how much longer until we arrive?" the vice priest asked. The leader bowed. "According to our current speed, it will take at most 4 days." The vice priest's voice was calm. "I know you are all tired, but if possible, please hurry up." A trace of worry flashed across Shui Zhang's cold and indifferent face. He said, "Yes." He turned and ordered, "Shorten the rest time by an hour." It was clear that he had an extremely high level of prestige within the wolf riders. No one expressed any objections. An hour later, the 36 wolf riders were divided into 3 groups to rest, maintaining a sufficient defensive strength at all times. Besides the leader, no one knew why they had been suddenly mobilized to escort the vice priest to the capital city in the strictest manner possible. But it was clear that it was an extremely important matter. Soon, the group set out once more. In the carriage that the vice priest was in, besides him, there was also a woman wrapped in a white dress. Only her limpid eyes were revealed, but they were filled with worry. "Vice priest, grandfather's decision this time is a bit inappropriate. After all, the saint flower isn't in good condition to begin with. If we leave the saint altar now, I fear She hesitated. The vice priest bitterly smiled, his eyebrows furrowing together. I understand your concerns, but the Saint Flower's condition is deteriorating by the day. If we don't grasp this chance, I fear it won't be long before it truly begins to wither. The girl called Dang Dang had a flash of worry in her eyes. As she thought, the Saint Flower's problems were extremely serious. The vice priest tried to comfort her. Don't be afraid. The priest and I have carefully investigated the situation. Honorable Ning's strength can be trusted. If he takes action, the Saint Flower will definitely be safe. Dang Dang's eyes brightened. Really? The vice priest nodded. If it weren't for this, how could the priest possibly take such a risk? He calmly smiled. As he looked at the girl's relaxed appearance, he sighed inwardly. Perhaps Honorable Ning really was a legendary spiritual bestower, but the Saint Flower was extraordinary in the end. As for whether or not it could be cured, no one had full confidence. But the Saint Flower really couldn't wait any longer. The problem was far more serious than anyone knew. The wolf riders raced forwards. They came from the most unruly tribe that had even directly confronted the capital city. They were the largest tribe of the old dynasty, and they continued forwards with hope in their hearts. Chapter 167. Turning their attention to the capital city, the solemn and dignified Noble Court Avenue was bustling with festivities today. Red and purple flowers filled the streets. The Qing family was marrying off a daughter today. The seats were filled with friends and honored guests. Caravans of congratulatory gifts lined up from one end of the street to the other. Countless young ladies felt sour in their hearts and envious at the same time. It had to be known that even if one was a member of Noble Court Avenue, not everyone could casually hold such a joyous event without any scruples. At the very least, the Qing family couldn't. But today's bustling event was the result of the joint decision of all the mansions on Noble Court Avenue. This wasn't to compliment the Qing family, but to express their respect and goodwill towards the mysterious and unfathomable figure behind the groom. Even now, no one knew the identity of this figure, but he was someone who sat high above the highest heavens. When the Qing family first announced that Honorable Ning would be absent, countless people were secretly pleasantly surprised. But as soon as the list of gifts was revealed, all of these thoughts were crushed to smithereens. There was no one on Noble Court Avenue that was unfamiliar with Wu Zetian's dwelling. After all, it had been built for over a decade, so they naturally knew just how valuable it was. Now, that dwelling that was rarely lived in after it was built was at the very front of the list of gifts. This alone was enough to show just how much Honorable Ning valued his disciple. No, in the eyes of all the families on Noble Court Avenue and even the entire capital city, this had already surpassed the scope of value. Rather, it was an absolute closeness, one that was viewed as a nephew. Otherwise, how could such a great gift be given? Thus, this was the reason why the Qing family was so excited today. The capital city looked over. Congratulations, congratulations. For the Qing family to obtain such a dragon-riding son-in-law, it is truly the envy of others. A talented man and a beautiful woman, this is a match made in heaven. The Qing family patriarch was all smiles. The grievances that had accumulated in his heart for so many years had finally been vented today. His entire person seemed much younger as he calmly greeted the guests. The groom has arrived. It was unknown who shouted this out. Countless sea folk turned around and saw the grand procession snaking towards them. Chief Manager Wu brightly smiled and cupped his hands together in greeting. Leon had a nervous expression. It was only when he arrived at the Qing family residence that he regained his composure. He hurriedly knelt down and kowtowed to the Qing family patriarch, calling him father. Clan Master Qing stroked his beard and smiled. He reached out his hand and pulled him up. The two of them whispered something, and the bride was soon sent to the door by her bridal family. Madame Qing wiped away her tears. She whispered to her daughter, "From now on, it will be just the two of you. Live well." Leon held Qingqing's hand and looked at his beautiful wife in a red dress. His heart was filled with excitement, and a deep sense of gratitude rose from the bottom of his heart. In a voice that only he could hear, he muttered, "Teacher, do you see? I'm married to Qingqing. Thank you." There were clouds in the sky, and above the clouds was the firmament. The firmament was divided into day and night, and there were stars everywhere. Late at night on a certain year, a meteor streaked across the horizon, dragging a long burning tail as it crashed heavily into the earth. The ground collapsed and was instantly torn apart, forming a bottomless gorge. The terrifying impact force surged and roared out, tearing everything on the ground apart and engulfing everything within 1,000 miles. After an unknown period of time, perhaps it was because the rain had gathered, or perhaps it was because the underground river had been broken open, but water began to gradually appear. The area where the heavens had once split apart turned into a lake and swamp. Fog gradually rose up, covering the lake and swamp. After swallowing up countless lives, it gradually became a dangerous land that few people visited. Thus, in the depths of the largest gorge, there was a boulder that had been washed away by countless streams of water. After a journey across the starry skies, it came to a quiet stop. The water gradually destroyed its solid surface. Day after day, the boulder became smaller and smaller, until it was finally the size of a thumb. One day, the earth shook and the boulder was flipped over. When the sun shone down, there was the sound of breaking air, clearly audible for hundreds of miles. Dantian Sea. Lotus seed, willow branch, crystal, bead, 4 elemental spiritual objects floated outside the golden core, echoing each other from afar. At this time, the 4 spiritual objects cried out in unison, cheering in joy. Between the lotus seed and bead, the void suddenly fluctuated. A thumb-sized iron stone appeared from within. An endless sharp aura erupted. It was like 10,000 swords had appeared, able to cut down the world. Whoosh, black water gushed out. Whoosh, blue divine light shined. Whoosh, crimson flames burned. Whoosh, an earth-colored halo of light rose up. Ever since he obtained the 5-element sword diagram, he had bitterly pursued it. He had experienced countless twists and turns, dangers, and he had nearly lost his life several times. Today, the 5 elemental spiritual objects had finally gathered together. Qing Yu opened his eyes. Even someone as calm as him couldn't help but be overjoyed at this moment. To him, the 5 elemental spiritual objects weren't simple treasures, but a great good fortune, a lucky chance. Now that everything was ready, all he needed to do was use the Great Divided Heaven Sutra to split his golden core and form the 5 elemental sources of magic power. Then, he could truly cultivate the 5-element sword diagram. The rise in his strength could be foreseen. But this also represented his limitless potential and prospects in the future. Fortune lurks in misfortune, and fortune lies within misfortune. This was a very, very old saying, so old that no one knew whether it was some great master that had painstakingly comprehended this saying, or whether it was some unlucky fool who had casually spoken it. But today, Qing Yu suddenly felt that these words were far too much of a bastard. Perhaps there was some hidden will that didn't like seeing Qing Yu obtain such a good fortune, so it casually moved its hand and gently pushed him. Like this, a change occurred without warning. Like this, all that was hidden was torn apart and revealed to the world. Within his Dantian Sea, outside of his golden core, the evenly distributed 5 elemental spiritual objects suddenly lost control. Or, it could be said that this was an instinctive will that couldn't be stopped. Thus, the white gold, black water, blue wood, red fire, and yellow earth suddenly began to circulate, like 5 islands that were connected together. Thus, the white gold flowed into the black water. The black water flowed into the blue wood. The blue wood ignited the red fire. The red fire submerged into the yellow earth. The yellow earth drilled into the white gold. Yu didn't know what was happening, but his niece told him that this change might be a good thing. But if it were to occur in the sea race capital city, it was likely to be a disaster. He might even be dragged into it, beyond redemption. His soul erupted with all its strength in an attempt to stop the changes occurring between the 5 elemental spiritual objects. But reality proved that this was futile. Thus, he could only watch helplessly on as the strength of the 5 elements circulated, becoming increasingly strong. Rumble, rumble, rumble. It was like a great river was recklessly rushing through his body. This great river gradually released a formidable strength. From 5 directions, it tore at the golden core on the great Tao base, wanting to transform its strength into a part of itself. Sweat tumbled out, instantly soaking his black robes. Yu's eyes flashed open and he roared out loud. Within his Dantian sea, the golden core trembled. This was another unexpected change. In the time it took for a spark to fly off a flint, countless thoughts raced through Yu's mind. He didn't know what would happen if he split his core, but if he continued to persist, his golden core might be torn apart. At that time, the result would truly be out of his control. Yu clenched his teeth. His eyes flashed with unswerving determination. He lifted a hand and slapped it between his eyebrows. As his palm fell between his eyebrows, a loud cracking sound rang out in his Dantian sea. Like a broken bead. Thus, on the great Tao base, that shining golden core really did break apart. It split into 5 equal portions and flew out with a whoosh. They were swallowed by the white gold, black water, green wood, red fire, and yellow earth. Yu stiffened. As his golden core broke apart, all of his aura was restrained. But the magic power within his body began to wildly revolve according to the law formula of the Great Divided Heaven Sutra. The 5 element spiritual objects trembled. They fused together with the golden core, undergoing the most critical transformation. And this transformation required a massive amount of heaven and earth spiritual strength. Thus, Yu's stiff body was like a black hole, crazily swallowing up the surrounding spiritual strength. The sea races had built their capital here, so this sea region was naturally extraordinary. There were 7 great spirit veins that converged underground, and the richness of the spiritual strength here surpassed imagination. But it was because of this that when the heaven and earth spiritual strength suddenly thinned, it became even more obvious. Within Sea's Spirit Pavilion, a crowd of Sea Spirit teachers looked up towards the same direction. Then, the scope of the ripple rapidly expanded. Countless sea race powerhouses frowned or looked at Sea Spirit Pavilion with bewildered expressions. Rumble, the sound of crashing waves echoed through the air. This was the flow of heaven and earth spiritual energy. If someone could clearly see the revolution of spiritual energy, they would discover that with Sea Spirit Pavilion as the center, a massive vortex of spiritual energy had appeared. It pulled the power in its surroundings and frantically poured it into a single point in the center before disappearing. Whoosh, whoosh, the Sea Folk powerhouse flew outside of Sea Spirit Pavilion, his expression dignified. Chief Manager Wu led some people out to welcome them. He cupped his hands across his chest. Everyone, Honorable Ning is currently in seclusion and cannot be disturbed. I ask for your understanding. Many members of the sea race were suddenly enlightened. So it was this person, then everything made sense. After all, Honorable Ning's methods and fierceness were something that the people of the capital city had personally experienced. Although the current situation was a bit overwhelming, it wasn't too excessive for Honorable Ning to do so. But, just what was Honorable Ning doing? More and more sea folk appeared, surrounding Sea Spirit Pavilion in dozens of layers. Everyone's eyes widened as they waited for the result to be revealed. Of course, he didn't disappoint them in the end. The incomparably fierce Honorable Ning had given everyone an unexpected pleasant surprise. Rumble rumble, the vortex of spiritual energy grew larger and larger. Strong winds whipped up in the void, causing clothes to flutter in the wind. Chief Manager Wu narrowed his eyes. He thought that Honorable Ning was truly extraordinary. It was easy for him to stir up some sort of commotion. After this matter, Sea Spirit Pavilion's reputation would likely become even more resounding. If this were made into a story and spread out, it would simply be the best advertisement. Moreover, it was true and the people of the capital city could testify to it. He silently praised himself for being quick-witted. But soon, Chief Manager Wu found it hard to maintain his smiling expression. Because as time passed, the wind seemed to become increasingly strong. Looking at the strong winds and the 9th-floor building that was gradually shaking, Chief Manager Wu was left dumbfounded. His only thought was that if he didn't make a name for himself this time, he feared this place would be torn apart. At this time, he was standing in the incomparably luxurious palace, chattering away as he spoke to the Sea Sovereign. From time to time, he would flatter her a few times, so vulgar that it would make her blush. But he had a serious expression on his face, as if everything he said was from the bottom of his heart. One couldn't help but admit that it was quite amazing to be able to flatter to such a degree. The Sea Sovereign was angered to the point of laughing. He waved his hand and scolded, "You took this Kukai's offering and this is how you do things. Hurry up and go back. Help me look after my private stash. I won't forgive you even if you lose a single coin." Soupman wickedly smiled. He patted his chest, causing his muscles to ripple. "Your Majesty, don't worry. Don't you know my methods? If anyone dares to touch a single one of your children, this old servant will make them bankrupt." This pair of master and servant had been in a stalemate ever since the change of the throne. Their relationship was far more intimate than anyone could imagine, which was why they could be so carefree. At this time, the Sea Sovereign's eyebrows arched up. He looked outside the palace. After several breaths of time, Soupman also sensed something. He had a surprised expression. It seems to be coming from the direction of Sea Spirit Pavilion. The Sea Sovereign nodded. "It's Honorable Ning." Soupman was like a cat that had its tail stepped on. He jumped up and shouted, What? It's related to Honorable Ning. Did something happen to him?" The Sea Sovereign shook his head. "I can't see the specifics." Soupman cupped his hands together and ran out. "Your Majesty, please forgive me. This old servant must go and take a look. No matter what, nothing can happen to Honorable Ning." These words weren't because he was worried about Qin Yu. In a small courtyard on the edge of the capital city, Meng Li's newly found little mistress was settled in. These past few days had been a period of tender affection and sweet love. Every day, he would seek out pleasures, and that was the best form of enjoyment. Of course, he didn't dare to bring her home. Tigresses were too fierce, so it was best to hide from her. After having his way with Xiaoqing, Meng Li was comfortably lying on the bed, enjoying the careful care and flattery of the woman beside him. He chuckled and then patted her butt. "Go and fetch some water for me to wash up. I still have some official business to deal with later, so the smell is too strong." Xiaoqing giggled. She twisted her body off the bed and put on a dress before leaving. Meng Li twirled his fingers as if savoring the aftertaste, but his mind had already turned to the most recent events. Suddenly, there was a loud scream. Meng Li shot up. His first thought was that he had been caught red-handed by the tigresses, so he grabbed his robes and wanted to run. But there was only Xiaoqing's voice outside and he didn't hear the courtyard door open. His eyes widened, anger rising in his heart. Who dared to peep at his woman? He rushed out several steps. Indeed, Xiaoqing was lying on the ground. She had a frightened expression and was crying non-stop. Her legs were slightly spread apart, revealing her naked body. Mengli shouted out loud, "Baby, what happened? I'll take responsibility for you." Oh, that sword, FFF flew away. Xiaoqing pointed at the well and stammered, as if she had been frightened. Mengli frowned. Could there be some sort of treasure hidden beneath this well? For it to fly away, he didn't need to think about it to know it wasn't simple. And most importantly, the sword had flown out from the well in his courtyard. No matter how he looked at it, it should be his. As he thought about how he hadn't sensed a treasure sword hiding in the well for such a long time, Mengli wanted to slap himself in the face. But it was too late to slap himself now. He angrily roared, "Where did it fly off to? That." Xiaoqing lifted her hand. Whoosh, Mengli shot into the skies. As he fastened his belt, a fierce light shined in his eyes. His treasure was his, and whoever dared to steal it, he would chop them up. Qin Yu was extremely distressed right now. Because his golden core had shattered, he hadn't felt any pain at all. It was only that his soul and consciousness had been temporarily isolated from his body. Thus, he could clearly sense the chaos he had stirred up in the outside world. Although he had a foreboding premonition, he was powerless to stop it. Within his Dantian Sea, the five-element spiritual objects had fused with his golden core, producing some strange changes. For a short period of time, his thirst for spiritual strength had reached the peak. Although the vortex of spiritual strength was fierce, it still couldn't satisfy this thirst. Thus, within his Dantian Sea, the white, black, blue, red, and yellow spheres of light began to tremble, like 5 volcanoes that could erupt at any moment. Qin Yu didn't doubt that the strength of these 5 volcanoes was enough to blow him to smithereens. At the same time, he would also set off some dazzling fireworks for the sea folk watching from the outside. He had painstakingly gathered the 5-element spiritual objects, but in the blink of an eye, all of his plans had been disrupted and he had even been forced into a dangerous situation. Just what was this? Suppressing his chaotic thoughts, Qin Yu's divine sense stirred. A storage shell opened and a mountain of spirit stones appeared, filling the entire workroom. The pure spiritual strength contained within the spirit stones seemed to be attracted, surging outwards. Although each spirit stone contained a limited amount of spiritual strength, when there were millions or even tens of millions of them, it was enough to form a raging current of spiritual strength that rumbled into Qin Yu's body along with the vortex of spiritual strength outside. This method of absorbing spiritual strength was already exaggerated to the extreme. Even with Qin Yu's powerful mortal body, he found it a bit difficult to withstand it. Blood began to flow out from his pores. But even with such a crazy influx of spiritual strength, the 5-colored spheres of light within his Dantian Sea still weren't satisfied. They trembled and roared, spiritual strength, they needed more spiritual strength. Qin Yu bitterly smiled. Could it be that in the end, the 5-element spiritual objects that had been refined into his body would explode into nothingness? This was far too taunting. His thoughts raced. He clenched his teeth. If he really died like this, he feared he would be listed as one of the top 10 most tragic ways to die in the cultivation world. Of course, the death he was talking about here wasn't the former, but the following. Rumble rumble from the storage snail, over 300 million spirit stones gushed out, submerging Qin Yu. In the human world, spirit stones were the size of a finger. The sea races were relatively wealthy, so they were half the size. Several dozen or several hundred together didn't count for much, but when there were over 100 million of them, it was a true mountain of spirit stones. What Qin Yu was doing now was stuffing a mountain into his workroom. A terrifying pressure instantly descended. Within Qin Yu's mortal body, the sounds of bones breaking rang out. Because his soul and consciousness had been separated, he didn't feel any pain. But, to personally see his body suffer such a horrifying ravaging wasn't something to be happy about. As the workroom's walls and floor emitted pained groans, Qin Yu sighed inwardly. He knew that after walking along the river for so long, his shoes would finally be wet. This was really fucked up. Chief Manager Wu could feel many gloating eyes sneaking glances at him and then glancing over. He didn't need to be a genius to know that they were related to the Sea Spirit world. Recently, Sea Spirit Pavilion's reputation had risen and it seemed as if it would soar into the heavens, surpassing all other forces. Their eyes were already red with envy. Humph, envy, envy. You want to see me embarrassed and disgraced? Old Wu, I won't let you have your way. Thus, he took a deep breath and then another. His expression was calm and composed, and the corners of his lips even curved up in an enigmatic smile. It was as if he already knew what was going to happen today. Yes, this was the attitude he wanted. The range of the vortex of spiritual strength increased. The crowd of onlookers was forced back a great deal and the wind within became even more terrifying. The once incomparably majestic 9-layer building now seemed as if all its feathers had been plucked clean. It looked a little distressed and inelegant. Not too far away, a sea spirit teacher had a worried expression. Please don't destroy my workroom. There are many things inside that I haven't taken out. Before he finished speaking, he received a sharp glare from Chief Manager Wu. He quickly swallowed the rest of his words and lowered his head like an ostrich. Cough. Everyone, rest assured. When our Sea Spirit Pavilion was building, we made appropriate arrangements to ensure safety. The decorations on the surface might be destroyed, but the main structure will be fine. These words weren't boasting, so Chief Manager Wu was naturally calm and confident. But that was how the slap came. It came without any warning. Gotcha, gotcha. Chapter 169. Just now, Chief Manager Wu's voice wasn't too loud but it wasn't too soft either. His original intention was to tell those people that he, Old Wu, was at ease and that they shouldn't gloat over his misfortune. Therefore, when they saw the collapse of the 7th floor and the subsequent collapse of the entire 9-story building, many people were stunned. Their eyes immediately turned into undisguised mockery. This slap to the face was truly resounding. Hee, look, Chief Manager Wu's face was actually able to turn this color. It was even more blue than blue, fierce, fierce, fierce. My sea spirit, my information. The sea spirit teacher who spoke before cried out in sorrow. His face was deathly pale as he tottered. Although the nearby sea folk weren't so frail, their complexions were ugly to the extreme. To a sea spirit teacher, a workroom was the most important place. It was far more important than their home. Now that they could only watch helplessly as their workroom was destroyed, it could be imagined just how miserable they were. Countless resentful eyes looked over. They wanted to speak but hesitated, and then, they really stopped. It wasn't just that they couldn't speak, but even their thoughts seemed to be tied up in knots. Even thinking about it became incomparably difficult. Palipala, if this could be called dubbing, then it should be the sound of the sea folks' jaws dropping to the ground. They were in a daze, as if they had lost their souls. After an unknown amount of time, an elongated, slightly shrill voice rang out. Spirit stones, what nonsense, of course they were spirit stones. Countless people cursed in their hearts. But they also regained their composure. As they looked at the collapsing 7-layer building and the tide of spirit stones gushing out, they groaned inwardly. This was just showing off their wealth, Was there really a need to be so violent and cruel that they didn't even leave a path for others to live? Gulp, the sound of gulping rang out in unison. It was a rather large-scale scene. Many people's eyes began to turn blood red, a burning heat in their eyes. Everyone had seen spirit stones before, but 99% of the people here had never seen so many spirit stones before. This was simply a mountain of spirit stones. Chief Manager Wu thought about how the 9-layer building he had worked so hard to build and how he had always been proud of it had been forcefully blown apart by this mountain of spirit stones. His lips twitched several times and he cried out in his heart, Honorable Ning, just what are you doing? Old Wu did not offend you. Elder Hai's status was extraordinary. He had already left the crowd and was watching from afar as he brewed a pot of good tea in a nearby tea house that had not been affected. An expert should have the bearing of an expert. No matter what, after being blessed with this halo, he had to maintain some self-respect. So, even though he couldn't watch the fun up close, fine, it wasn't good for little friend Ning to say this, but he was the one who did it, and it was also the truth. Cough cough. Returning to the main topic, he was disappointed that he couldn't watch the fun up close, but he still maintained a calm expression on his face. However, at this moment, Old Hai's demeanor as an expert was completely broken as he spat out a mouthful of tea. He waved his hand at the tea house owner, who had an aggrieved expression and was trying to curry favor with him. He rushed to the railing and craned his neck to look ahead. It was several breaths of time before he regained his composure. He whispered to himself, in the past, I was known as Spirit City Spouting God. I dominated the capital city for many years, and I was also known as the little prince of the world of flaunting his wealth. But, compared to little friend Ning, I am far, far worse. Clearwood had an awkward expression. Teacher. She didn't want to speak, but with so many people present, it would really be shameful if someone heard her. Old Hai tidied up his clothes. He had a calm appearance, as if nothing had happened. He lightly said, Little friend Ning must have his reasons for doing things. You'll know once you keep watching. It seemed as if Clearwood had been quietly asking for advice just now. This adaptability left Clearwood secretly admiring. She looked up at the spirit stone mountain and an inexplicable thought raced through her mind. If he was so rich, even if she desperately ate for the rest of her life, she still wouldn't be able to eat too much. Her face blushed red and she quickly lowered her head to hide it. But, her eyes were a bit dimmer. The landmark of the capital city, 9-layer building, was broken in half. With a loud rumble, the earth trembled and dust flew into the air. But at this time, everyone narrowed their eyes, none of them having any intention of leaving. They stared straight at the spirit stone mountain, all of them thinking the same thing, fall down, fall down, fall down. But, what left everyone disappointed was that this spirit stone mountain was extremely firm. It hung in the air without a single spirit stone falling down. If they could steal this spirit stone mountain, then they might be able to live the rest of their lives in security. Some people continued to be disappointed. But there were also some that gave birth to greed in their disappointment. Then, their eyes turned dangerous. The capital city had gathered all sorts of sea folk, and there was no lack of people from all walks of life. Although it was an extremely high risk to try and steal in the streets, when compared to the benefits, it seemed like they could still take a gamble. Old Hai's eyes turned cold. He coldly said, Some people have really been blinded by spirit stones and want to die. He waved his hand and several cultivators below the tea house turned and left. Chief Manager Wu was experienced and quickly responded. With a single order, the guards of Sea Spirit Pavilion rushed out, forming a human wall that separated the crowd. Conflict erupted without warning. 3 sea folk pushed away the guards and rushed towards the Spirit Stone Mountain, their eyes filled with greed. Stop them! Chief Manager Wu roared. 4 sea mantis swordsmen leapt high into the air. Dazzling sword light wove together into a net that covered the three sea folk. Puff, puff, there was the sound of flesh being cut apart. Dark red flowers bloomed and the earth was filled with the smell of blood. But just as the situation slowed down, more people attacked from the crowd. Moreover, they were all masters. The four sea mantis swordsmen were extremely strong. When they joined forces, the killing power of their sword net was even more terrifying. But two concealed sea folk cooperated and managed to delay them, causing the battle to fall into a tense situation. These two people had a tacit understanding of each other. But, from some details, it could be seen that they weren't companions. Rather, it was as if they had suddenly decided to cooperate and attack together. For a time, the Sea Spirit Pavilion guards suffered heavy casualties. Chief Manager Wu had already slaughtered his way into the crowd, his face pale. With Sea Spirit Pavilion's prestige and Honorable Ning status, there were actually so many powerhouses attacking him. If someone said that there wasn't a secret behind this, he absolutely wouldn't believe it. Someone wanted to take advantage of this chance to harm Honorable Ning. Who was it? Although Blue Sky Tower and Earthfault Spire were strong, they were too large a force to be reckoned with. Otherwise, once they discovered any clues, they would be destroyed in the blink of an eye. Chief Manager Wu's heart chilled. Could this be related to the invitation that came from the royal palace not too long ago? The more he thought about it, the more likely it was. Beads of sweat dripped down his forehead. If this really involved the royal family, then things were truly troublesome. Teacher! Clearwood cried out in panic. Old C sucked in a deep breath. Just as he was about to say something, he suddenly looked up at the end of the street. A large group of royal guards surged forwards like a raging tide. The one leading them was Soupman. At this time, his face was dark and gloomy, and the ruthlessness in his eyes left one trembling. Attack! Capture them alive! Whoosh! The spectating sea folk drew back in panic. The battle instantly tilted to one side. The royal guards were all elites. Although they weren't individually strong, when they joined forces in battle, their killing power was terrifying. The 14 sea folk that attacked died one after another. The two masters that had resisted the 4 sea folk swordsmen fell into a heavy encirclement. As if they knew there was no hope for them to live, they crazily attacked the royal guards. On the back of the seahorse, Soupman was expressionless. As he looked at them, it was as if they were two corpses. Puff, puff, the crazed tide of royal guards began to retreat, revealing 2 riddled corpses that lay in pools of blood. The capital city's main street is attacking a purple card in front of everyone. It seems that someone wants to change the heavens. Soupman slowly said, his eyes sweeping around. I will be right here. I want to see just who is doing this. The result was that no one dared to move at all. Countless sea folk paled, their eyes filled with fear. They never imagined that things would develop to this step. To attack Honorable Ning on the streets and then think of Soupman's words, a chill rose in their hearts and they quickly suppressed these thoughts. Old C quickly walked forwards. He cupped his hands across his chest and said, Soupman. He immediately lowered his voice, why did you kill them all? With Soupman's personality, if he wanted to capture them alive then he would have done it himself. In front of him, these sea folk that attacked weren't anything at all. When he said, capture them alive, it seemed more like he was reminding these sea folk that they should be prepared to end their own lives. Soupman had a light expression. Sea Lingdu, there are some things that you shouldn't know, so don't ask. Old C frowned but didn't say anything. This was because Soupman's words had already given him a hint. As he thought, little friend Ning had been implicated in that matter. He looked up at the spirit stone mountain, a bit of helplessness in his eyes. He thought to himself, if you want to leave the capital city this time, I'm afraid there really isn't any hope left. As the smell of blood filled the air and countless sea folk were panicking, a black sword broke through the air. Supman's eyes instantly turned cruel. A terrifying aura circulated around him. He slowly looked up, the air around him seeming to freeze. But in the next moment, he frowned. He could feel a faint aura coming from the black sword. So it was Honorable Ning's treasure. The aura instantly converged and he returned to his indifferent appearance. He watched as the black sword drilled into the spirit stone mountain. Commander Meng Li gasped for breath. As he saw this from afar, he felt as if someone had kicked him in the chest, making his heart ache. He had an intuition that the treasure sword that he had chased with all his might never return. Although he didn't recognize Supman, with such a large group of royal guards and the blood covering the ground, it was clear that something major had occurred. He took several deep breaths and grabbed onto the sea folk around him. What happened? After asking a few questions and learning what had happened, Commander Meng Li's eyes were filled with bitterness. Honorable Ning, it was actually Honorable Ning, it was over, the treasure had been completely lost. To the diligent and thrifty Commander Meng Li, this was a nearly unbearable blow. He took a deep breath and then another. Strong, 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 don't cry. Woo 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 woo, if you're so rich, why did you steal my treasure sword? Woo 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 woo, give me back my sword. Buried deep beneath the spirit stone mountain, the black sword suddenly drilled out from beside Qin Yu. It could feel its master crazily thirsting for spiritual strength. Although the wild influx of spiritual strength had caused serious damage to his mortal body and blood to flow out, if he couldn't replenish his spiritual strength, his master would surely die. If Qin Yu died, then although it wouldn't die, who knew whether or not it would be able to find such a reliable master again. After all, it had lived a good life following him. Thus, the black sword hovered between Qin Yu's eyebrows. With a point, it pierced through Qin Yu's head. Dark red beads of blood seeped out. Chapter 170. In fact, no one could have imagined that the 100 nether swords' return would pour oil over today's matters and cause them to completely explode. Between Qin Yu's eyebrows, the blood bead reflected the black sword. Within the deep red, there was a bit more black. Then, this black color spread out like ink. It turned into a palm-sized black hole that connected to some unknown place. A cold and gloomy aura flowed out and one could faintly hear the howling of the wind, like the howls of the undead. In a small courtyard on the edge of the capital city, Commander Meng Li's new mistress, Lil Qing, was washing her body with a look of lingering fear. She thought that this place was as unclean as the rumors said and she absolutely couldn't live here anymore. Once the old master returned, she would beg him to quickly change residences. Just as she was thinking about what methods she could use to entice Commander Meng Li to agree and then fantasize about her future residence, the smile on Lil Qing's face froze. Several gurgling sounds came from her throat, as if someone were grabbing her by the neck. She found it difficult to breathe. Kacha, kacha, ice appeared on the surface of the hot water that was washing her body. It began to condense at an astonishing speed. In the courtyard, within the deep well, the cold water began to boil. Bang! A black beam of light shot into the skies, like an invisible hand stabbing into the heavens of the capital city. But, what was strange was that it didn't tear apart the spells of the capital city. Rather, the moment it touched them, it vanished from sight. Beneath this beam of light was a desolate land on the edge of the capital city. Gray fog covered the ground, making it impossible to see what was happening within. Now, this fog tumbled about, condensing into the phantoms of powerful sea monsters that reared their heads back and roared. The entire capital city was shaken by this sudden change. Countless sea folk looked up at this desolate land, their complexions gradually paling. Some old sea folk whispered with panic in their eyes. The sea mausoleum, it's the sea mausoleum. They thought back to the calamity of the capital city in the past. 100,000 seafolk had died and the smell of blood had covered the earth. This wasn't a secret at all. The seafolk that lived in the capital city knew something about it. Fear was like a plague, wildly spreading through the seafolk. At the main entrance of the royal palace, a bronze bell rang. The sea sovereign's complexion was grim. His eyes were deep like vortexes and a boundless aura rose up. In the skies above the royal palace, the phantom of a flood dragon appeared. It was 10,000 feet long, with golden scales and purple eyes. Winds and clouds gathered, and the image of a flood dragon swam about, appearing and disappearing from time to time. Dragon roars rang out, and a horrifying dragon might spread out with the palace as the center. The panic in the capital city gradually subsided. They all knelt on the ground, kowtowing in the direction of the palace. In the great calamity of the past, it was also the sea sovereign who stepped forwards and sacrificed 1,000 years of his life to seal away the sea mausoleum. Beneath the 9-layer pagoda, Supman's complexion paled. He mumbled, "Your Majesty." His face twisted and he roared out in a low voice, "What is going on? What the fuck is going on here?" Given His Majesty's condition, he could no longer make a move. Otherwise, the leakage of his strength would be detected, and heavenly tribulation would descend in an instant. He raised his head to look at the sky above the capital. Sure enough, there were already black clouds surging out. A brilliant and dignified aura caused all living beings to fall silent. That was the will of heaven and earth. If His Majesty had chosen to transcend tribulation and fight back then, he might have had a chance to survive. But now, he had deceived the heavenly mysteries and would inevitably incur the wrath of heaven and earth. There was no way he could survive the heavenly tribulation. Supman wanted to stop His Majesty, but he knew that it was impossible. His Majesty would definitely attack. Motherfucker, motherfucker, motherfucker. Supman seemed to have gone crazy. He looked at the black clouds above his head and repeatedly cursed, his expression fierce. Without warning, the scene of a great calamity of life appeared in front of the people of the capital city. They stared with wide eyes, panic-stricken and helpless. They could only wait for it to arrive. Even within the royal palace, the most powerful king in the world had already prepared himself to die and seal away the sea spirit as the price. His eyes were faint, without any fear at all. This was because this was his duty and responsibility as a king. Time slowly passed. But what was strange was that even though there was a great commotion, the calamity brought about by the aura of specters didn't occur. Besides the black beams of light that shot into the horizon and the rumbling sounds that followed, the capital city remained tranquil as before. The sea sovereign frowned. At this time, the doors to the hall were pushed open. 2 officials rushed in with distressed expressions, waving their hands. "Your Majesty, please calm down. Your Majesty, please calm down. We have carefully investigated just now and the sea mausoleum spells are still running." The spirit shell in Supman's chest began to ring out. He grabbed it and placed it by his ear, listening to it for a few moments. Then, the suffocating gloominess around him suddenly vanished. He looked up at the nervous old sea and nodded, his voice hoarse. "There is no problem with the sea mausoleum spells." He put away the spirit shell and looked up at the black beam of light, a puzzled look in his eyes. At the same time, this news spread to all sides in the shortest possible time. But like Supman, these sea folk all had the same question in their hearts: if there was no problem with the sea mausoleum spells, then what was happening right now? The spirit stones were pulled in by an invisible suction force, not a single one falling down. From a mountain, it gradually turned into a sphere that wrapped up the figure within. Thus, no one saw that the black hole between Qin Yu's eyebrows suddenly trembled. Then, a black torrent surged out. Outside 9-layer building, Supman's pupils shrank. He stubbornly stared at the giant sphere of spirit stones. The spiritual vortex roared and spun. Ordinary sea folk might not be able to sense it, but to him it was like a lantern in the dark night. The aura of the sea mausoleum. He slowly said, his eyes as sharp as blades. Sealing do, just what is Honorable Ning doing? As a purple card, a formidable soul was indispensable. Thus, when Old Sea sensed the sudden arrival of the aura, his complexion changed. First, there was the change in the sea mausoleum and the black beam of light that shot into the heavens. Now, the aura of the sea mausoleum had appeared here. He wouldn't believe that there wasn't a connection between the two. Old Sea took a deep breath and shook his head. Ever since he returned from the royal palace, he has gone into seclusion. I have no idea what he is doing. But, I believe that he absolutely won't try to destroy the sea mausoleum spells. I can guarantee this. Supman's complexion darkened. He coldly snorted, his eyes uncertain. If it were anyone else related to the changes in the sea mausoleum, he would have already moved to suppress them. Anyone that tried to threaten His Majesty should be destroyed. But, it just had to be Ning Qin. As he was considering what to do, the spirit shelf sounded out once more. The sea sovereign's light voice echoed out from within, keep watching. Old Sea relaxed a little, but his complexion was still dignified. He bitterly smiled as he looked at the giant sphere of spirit stones. Ning Qin, you've stirred up a great deal of trouble this time. Within the black hole, the black torrent submerged Qin Yu, fusing into his body through his pores. The formidable spiritual strength contained within surpassed the limits of his mortal body. His skin instantly cracked open like a broken porcelain doll. Before blood could flow out, it was shaken into a bloody fog by the formidable strength. Peep, his flesh and blood disintegrated. The 100 nether sword floated in front of the black hole. Only after the black torrent passed through it was it able to pour into Qin Yu's body. As it saw his miserable appearance, the sword subconsciously trembled. In comparison, it was currently incomparably nourished. The spectral aura carried by the black torrent had been cleanly swallowed up by it. It was like it was eating a delicious meal while watching Qin Yu suffer a cruel torture. Of course, no matter what, the 100 nether sword would never admit this. It was only doing this in order to help its master overcome this difficult time. Otherwise, if it didn't absorb the spectral aura, its master wouldn't be able to withstand it. Yes, that was it. The 100 nether sword was instantly filled with righteousness. Within his Dantian sea, the vortex of spiritual strength, the spirit stones, and the strength from the sea mausoleum all superimposed together. Finally, the requirements to condense the 5 elemental sources of magic power were met. White, black, blue, red, and yellow spheres of light swallowed up a massive amount of spiritual strength, gradually stabilizing. But as they continued to fuse and transform, the amount of spiritual strength they absorbed became increasingly greater. Even with Qin Yu's powerful demon body, he was gradually unable to withstand it. His flesh and blood began to collapse faster and faster. Even his bones began to tremble and groan as cracks appeared on them. Blood fog was like a tide, gradually covering him. It dyed the surrounding spirit stones red and some even floated into the black hole. Roar! A repressed roar echoed out from the black hole, filled with endless desire. Then, from the surging black torrent, a claw suddenly stretched out, grasping at Qin Yu as if it wanted to pull him in. The 100 nether sword cried out. It cut down like a bolt of black lightning. The claw that stretched out from the black torrent was instantly cut apart and disintegrated. Within the black hole, the roar became pained, filled with unwillingness and anger. But with a cold and sharp sword cry, the 100 nether sword issued a warning. The roar gradually quieted down until it finally vanished from sight. The sword point turned towards Qin Yu. The 100 nether sword was deep in thought. If it could make a human expression, it would definitely be one of worry and worry. If it didn't do anything, Qin Yu would likely die. But if it did, it would consume a great deal of the strength it had painstakingly accumulated. Perhaps what it ate today wouldn't be enough. If that was the case, then this would be a massive loss. Why was it that in this world there were always so many dilemmas? Whatever, as a sword that had a caring heart, a conscience, a sense of justice, and a sense of gratitude, it couldn't do something like stand idly by and watch someone die. Of course, it would definitely remember this debt. In the future, it would think of a way to slowly collect it back. The 100 nether sword lightly trembled. Black fog gushed out from the surface of the sword blade. It tumbled about, as if it had a spiritual sense. It rapidly transformed into the phantom of an altar. If someone were to see this, they would discover that this pitch-black altar was quite similar to the one in Prosperity Square outside the royal palace that was used to offer sacrifices to the sea spirit. Of course, this similarity referred to the aura and some special characteristics, not just the surface. The blood fog was attracted over and rapidly settled deep within the altar. Then, a cross-legged figure gradually appeared within the phantom of the black altar. Then, countless threads grew out from the altar and drilled into the surrounding spirit stones. They were like the roots of a great tree. They absorbed the spiritual strength within the spirit stones and poured it into the altar, transforming it into a powerful life energy that was then poured into the figure deep within the altar. Thus, Qin Yu's torn skin, torn flesh, and cracked bones began to wildly regenerate. Although they often ruptured and tore apart before they could fully grow, they were still able to maintain his mortal body so that it wouldn't collapse and be destroyed. Chapter 171. The team of 5 killer whales stopped in a place where they could see the capital city from afar. The woman had a dignified expression as she saw the black pillar of light that shot into the skies. "Seventh Auntie, what is that?" After the young girl woke up, she didn't even have time to wash her face. She had a somewhat lazy expression and a trace of excitement shined in her black and white eyes. The woman was a bit helpless, but she couldn't bear to blame her. She sighed and said, "Miss, this isn't something fun. If I'm not wrong, this black pillar of light should be related to the Sea Mausoleum." Sea Mausoleum. The young girl blinked. It is a very sacred and also a very sinful place. If there really is a problem with it, I fear the capital city will suffer a calamity. The woman had a dignified expression. At that time, I have no idea how many innocent people will be buried within. Seeing the young girl reveal a trace of fear, the woman smiled and patted her hand. "Miss, don't be afraid. If there is a problem we can return to Sega City. Nothing will happen." The scout that had been sent to investigate the situation had a flustered look on his face. The woman's heart sank. She had already prepared herself for something bad to happen, but the truth was beyond her expectations. The young girl was stunned. She turned and said, "Seventh Auntie, is this Honorable Ning the person you spoke of? He seems to be a very bad person. He actually tore down our Sea Spirit Pavilion's capital city branch division." The woman forced a smile. "Miss is right. When we meet, I will definitely ask him why he tore down our 9-layer building." After a few comforting words, the woman waited for the young girl to hop away. Then, her complexion darkened and a cold light flowed in her eyes. The guard captain walked over and sighed. "Something isn't right." The woman sneered. "Honorable Ning shouldn't have any malicious intent towards my Sea Spirit Pavilion. I fear that someone wants to use this matter to move against our Sega City." The guard captain shook his head. "It is too early to say such things. Moreover, this involves the Sea Mausoleum. I don't think anyone would dare to move against it. The woman thought for a moment. What you say is reasonable. Then, let's take a look first. But, if it really is me, then don't blame me for being impolite. The killer whale's massive body was directly proportional to its astonishing speed. It soon arrived at the capital city. Facing the questioning of the capital city guards, the guard captain took out a token and all the guards respectfully bowed. The killer whale's body is too big and it is inconvenient to enter the capital city, so it is left outside the capital city in a marine pasture specially for various large mounts. The leader of the guards took out the pink carriage from his storage conch. After the young girl and the middle-aged woman boarded the carriage, he led the guards into the royal city. At this time, in the opposite direction, there was also a group of soldiers silently approaching. The warriors on the wolf riders were incomparably tired, but their eyes were still cold and fierce. At a glance, one could feel the pressure coming from it. It was as if a giant wolf was about to pounce on them. The guards subconsciously tightened their grip on the weapons in their hands. Even though they still maintained the calmness and dignity that the guards of the capital should have, their faces turned pale. In front of them was a battle-hardened and terrifyingly powerful battalion. If they really fought, even though they looked exhausted, they would probably be able to kill all of them in a few moves. Shuizheng sat up straight, his callous face without the least bit of expression. Moon Praying Shrine's Wolf Rider Division, escort the vice priest to the capital city. Please let us pass. As he spoke, the several guards across from him began to shiver. That feeling just now was as if a vicious beast had locked onto them from the shadows, ready to tear them to pieces in the next moment. And what was especially terrifying was that they knew that this wasn't an intentional threat, but a natural aura that was emitted. The little leader gulped. He braced himself and said, "The capital city does not allow unknown battalions to enter. I need to verify your identities." Before he finished speaking, his words were destroyed by an indifferent glare. Shuizheng slowly said, "Where the wolf riders are is evidence in itself. There is no need to prove anything." Gently patting the mount, the giant sea wolf swept its eyes over the capital city guards with contempt and then stepped forwards. Behind it, the wolf riders slowly followed, escorting the carriage. To other tribes, the capital city might possess unsurpassed authority, but many years ago, Moon Praying Shrine had already clashed with the capital city several times. For them to exist to this day, that was enough to prove their strength. Naturally, they were able to maintain their pride and formidable self-confidence. The guards were oppressed by the aura. Although they wanted to stop them, it was as if their feet had taken root. They could only watch helplessly as the group entered the capital city. The little leader's face flushed red. He lowered his voice and roared, "Who cares about Moon Praying Shrine? This is the capital city. Immediately pass on the news and let the lords decide what to do." Shuizheng's eyes swept over the black beam of light. He turned and approached the carriage. "Vice priest, do you need to rest first?" "We won't rest. We will go straight to Sea Spirit Pavilion." Moon Praying Shrine had no respect for the capital city, but they couldn't help but acknowledge that this was the heart of the sea races, so they were quite familiar with the map of the capital city. Of course, if one wanted to ask whether or not this familiarity had some sort of disrespectful intent in it, then that would depend on the benevolent and the wise. 9-layer building could be considered a landmark in the capital city, and Shuizheng knew where it was. The wolf riders changed directions and went straight ahead. Along the way, the sea folk all retreated, their eyes full of surprise. Most of them didn't know where such a valiant battalion had come from. But at this time, 9-layer building had already collapsed into ruins. Strong winds wrapped around it, causing dust to fill the skies. It no longer looked like a landmark at all. Chief Manager Wu didn't even have the strength to complain. At this time, no matter how many tears he had, they could only silently flow down in his heart. But looking at the situation, it seemed that today's events weren't normal. He hoped that Honorable Ning wouldn't provoke any trouble because of this. He looked up at Soup Man, who had a grim expression and was emitting an unfriendly aura. He whispered inwardly. Suddenly, an awe-inspiring feeling descended. It was like a sharp blade was pressing down on one's body, as if a mountain was covering one's head. It caused one's mind to tremble and instinctively feel a sense of dread. Chief Manager Wu fiercely looked up. He discovered that the skies above the capital city had darkened. Black clouds gushed out from nothingness and began to condense. This was heavenly tribulation. His eyes widened. Who was it that didn't want their lives anymore? They actually dared to cross tribulation in the capital city. Soup Man looked up, his eyes like blades as he locked onto the condensing tribulation clouds. He frowned for a moment before composing himself. The capital city didn't allow the sea folk to cross tribulation. Firstly, the power of heavenly tribulation would damage the capital city's restrictive spells, and secondly, if there was interference from the spells, the might of heavenly tribulation would greatly increase. Looking at the aura, this should be nascent soul tribulation. It wasn't easy to cultivate to this step, but were they stupid? Why would they do such a suicidal thing? Soupman's mind raced for a moment before he composed himself. This was only a mere nascent soul. There were many powerhouses amongst the sea folk, so one dying wasn't anything at all. Right now, the only thing he was concerned about was the giant sphere of spirit stones in front of him. Even if it involved Ning Qin and the Sea Mausoleum, he still needed a reasonable explanation. But as time passed, the tribulation clouds in the skies became increasingly thick. Gradually, it seemed as if they were coming towards this place. Soupman's eyes fiercely jumped. He looked up at the tribulation clouds and then swept his eyes around. If he wasn't blind, then he could see that the tribulation clouds were moving towards the same target as him. Ning Qin, Honorable Ning, he was crossing tribulation. Soupman's heart instantly leapt into his throat. He nearly cursed out loud. It doesn't matter if you die, but don't cause His Majesty to be unable to save you. He clenched his teeth and stepped forwards. His figure shot into the skies, blocking between the tribulation clouds and the giant sphere of spirit stones. Even if he had to suffer a minor injury, he still had to block this heavenly tribulation. As if sensing Soupman's actions, the tribulation clouds began to tumble. With a loud rumbling sound, lightning wreaked havoc as it came crashing down. Soupman's complexion changed and immediately darkened. This heavenly tribulation, something was wrong. But at this time, he didn't have time to think about it. He stepped forwards, clenched his fist, and punched out at the thunder. There was a loud explosion like the crashing of a mountain. Thunder shattered and splashed out in all directions. Some unlucky fellows were struck and instantly fell to the ground, foaming at the mouth. Walala, the sea folk fled in panic. Soupman's sleeves were torn and there were many scorch marks all over his body. His neatly combed hair seemed to have experienced a violent storm, spreading out in all directions. Nascent soul heavenly tribulation normally had 3 bolts of thunder. Now, this was only the first bolt, and yet its power had reached such a degree. Soup Man looked down and clenched his teeth in hatred. But the more it was like this, the more he couldn't retreat. He had to grit his teeth and swallow his blood to withstand this heavenly tribulation. Bang! The second bolt of thunder fell. Soupman's entire sleeves turned to ashes, revealing a well-maintained and fair arm. But when combined with his eye-catching hair, it seemed particularly strange. He had lived his entire life in comfort and comfort. Even when he was young, he had never had the experience of making a fool of himself in front of everyone. If it weren't for the fact that his heart was strong enough to control his mood, he feared his face would have already turned red. That damned Ning Qin. Bang! The third bolt of thunder. If the first two bolts of heavenly tribulation were like a sword that came from the east, difficult to resist, then this third bolt of heavenly tribulation was like a mountain pressing down on him. It was vast and mighty, filled with a dense aura of annihilation. Even someone as strong as Superman couldn't help but feel his heart race. He cursed out loud and then shot into the skies. It wasn't that he didn't fear heavenly tribulation, but because of the special nature of his cultivation method. Only then could he erupt with his greatest strength. Bang! Lightning splashed out, instantly submerging Superman's figure. But in the next moment, he was sent flying backwards and smashed into the ground. A building that had been destroyed by the strong winds had been completely razed to the ground, and even the foundation had been ruthlessly torn apart. My family's ancestral shop. In the distance, the shop owner cried out in sorrow as he fell backwards. Bang! Bits and pieces of debris were sent flying away. Superman walked out with a gloomy face. If his long hair had been eye-catching before, it was now eye-catching to the extreme. This was because his hair was indeed an afro, and it was the most avant-garde and cool kind. As he spat on the ground, he walked towards the spirit stone sphere, his eyes filled with ill intent. Now that the heavenly tribulation has passed, you brat Ning-Chin, shouldn't you come out now? In my life, it has always been me, old Superman, who has taken advantage of others. I have never suffered such a great loss before. I will clearly remember this debt and we will slowly settle it in the future. As he walked, he accidentally tore a part of his body, causing a heart-wrenching pain. Old Superman stiffened. He forced himself to maintain a calm expression as he gnashed his teeth in hatred. Chapter 172. The heavens and earth were heartless, treating all living things as dogs. Well, this was a phrase that had been used all over the streets. But to a certain degree, this reasoning was correct. To the world, there were trillions of lives, and whether they were noble or lowly, there was no difference. But since it was described to a certain degree, there were clearly special exceptions. For instance, cultivators were a special group that received more love. Whether it was the righteous, demonic, monster, or evil, they all had a common understanding, and that was that the world had its own will. It was only because it was bound by the rules that it couldn't interfere with the revolution of the great Tao. This rule constraint could only be temporarily lifted at a special time, and that was heavenly tribulation. Cultivators that committed all sorts of evil, loved to kill, and loved to poison others would inevitably face formidable heavenly tribulation. Only a small number of people would be able to successfully cross it, and most of them would be turned to ash. This wasn't nonsense, but a truth that cultivators had discovered after experiencing tens of millions of lightning strikes. Thus, even the most vicious and evil of evil spirits wouldn't casually harm mortals. This was to avoid karma and death beneath tribulation thunder. Today, the 3 bolts of tribulation thunder were already abnormally strong. Superman had thought that Chin-Yu must have done something that angered the heavens and angered mankind, thus causing the world to punish him. But now, 3 bolts of heavenly tribulation had passed and the tribulation clouds hadn't dissipated. Instead, they tumbled even more fiercely, and the terrifying pressure gradually increased. This was wrong. This was completely wrong. This could no longer be considered heavenly tribulation, but more like the will of the world itself. It was determined to kill Ning-Chin on the spot, and such matters were only recorded in ancient texts. Superman never imagined that he would personally experience it, thus he cursed out loud. This was because he couldn't imagine just how many evil deeds one had to commit in order to be rejected by the world. The tribulation clouds above the capital city grew larger and larger, casting down a massive shadow. Just being within them caused the hearts of countless sea folk to tremble as if they had fallen into an icy lake. Old Sea whispered, "Inevitable death tribulation, it's actually, inevitable death tribulation." His eyes were filled with bitterness and complexity. Superman, you cannot block this heavenly tribulation. Otherwise, even if you receive 3 more bolts, there will be more, and they will become increasingly strong. Only Ning Qin can pass this trial by himself. Superman paled. Do you think I don't know? But you also saw the might of the heavenly tribulation just now. If I didn't act then he would have died. He didn't say the following words, but the meaning was clear. If Ning Qin died, what would happen to His Majesty? Of course, this was indeed very realistic. Because on the other hand, if His Majesty was fine, he wouldn't care how Ning Qin died. Old Hai shook his head. There's no other way. We can only gamble. Otherwise, the further we go, the less likely it will be. Superman clenched his teeth. Rumble, the tribulation clouds roiled like a great tide, and the terrifying sound waves shook the world. Dazzling lightning swept out in all directions, and then the 4th bolt of heavenly tribulation descended. With just a glance, Superman's heart sank. Even if he were to attack this thunder, he might not be able to escape unscathed, much less Ning Qin. If he died, the glimmer of hope that His Majesty had would vanish. You bastard! Superman roared out, but it was unknown who he was targeting. As soon as the heavenly tribulation appeared and Superman intervened to block it, the countless sea folk watching had already fallen silent. They stared at the scene before them with wide eyes. However, no one had expected that after 3 bolts of tribulation lightning, it still hadn't ended. The aura of the 4th bolt of heavenly tribulation swept out. Countless sea folk paled. They looked at the giant sphere of spirit stones, their eyes filled with astonishment and pity. Poor Honorable Ning. Beneath such tribulation lightning, even a nascent soul realm existence might not be able to resist it, so how could he not die? At the same time, there were many sea folk that had pained expressions. They could only stare helplessly on as trillions of spirit stones were destroyed by heavenly tribulation. This was simply unacceptable. Chief Manager Wu was stunned. He looked at the tribulation thunder in a daze. Everything had been fine, so how had things suddenly developed to this step? Clearwood bit her lips, her face pale. Her mind was a chaotic mess and she couldn't think of anything else. In the distance, in a tall building, there was an imposing figure standing tall. His black armor was like a mountain, and even though he didn't move, he seemed to be able to suppress the entire world. There were 7 or 8 sea folk in the building, most of them unfamiliar faces. They were scattered about. If there were sea folk that were familiar with the capital city here, they would discover that most of them were powerful tyrants, and one of them was even a key figure in the military. At this time, these sea folk slightly lowered their heads, expressing their respect to this truly great figure. There is definitely a problem with the companion vine. Although the royal palace has blocked off all news, it is still possible to detect it through all the changes. A fair-skinned sea folk with a soft and gentle temperament said in a soft voice, finding it hard to hide his regret. What a pity, this accident has already been resolved, otherwise we might have been able to achieve our goal with the smallest possible price. He looked up, not daring to leap over the imposing figure's height. He looked towards the giant sphere of spirit stones in the air, his eyes full of praise. Although I am angry, I cannot help but admit that this Honorable Ning is an extremely skilled person. A sea folk coldly sneered. So what if he is skilled? In the end, he isn't one of us. Everyone from the Southern River office was taken away by the tax department, but the losses were all meaningless. The fat old man clenched his teeth. It wasn't just the Southern River office that was lost, but also the assassins under my command. This was a familiar face. During the Great Sea Spirit Teacher competition, he had accompanied Jing Guanjin the entire time. The assassins that had been exterminated by the Black Knights in the streets of the capital city had all been painstakingly trained by him. Of course, there were also the two people that had been killed by the royal palace guards during the chaos caused by the spirit stones. Someone stepped forward to stop the conversation. "That's enough. No matter what, he will die." These words caused the complexions of the people in the room to relax. They subconsciously let out sighs of relief. He was like a predestined nemesis. Ever since Ning Qin appeared, nothing had gone smoothly for them. Not only had they spent a great deal of time and effort preparing for the Great Sea Spirit Teacher competition, but they had also lost Jing Guanjin and Wu Zetian. The situation in the royal palace had taken a turn for the better, but he had interfered and ruined it, causing the Southern River office to be exposed. There was also a series of hidden disturbances and shock waves. Presumably, as time passed, the number of people who died would continue to increase. Now, he was finally going to die. But what a pity, the wonderful situation they had been waiting for all these years had been lost. Thinking of this, the sea folk in the room were filled with helplessness. Their eyes fell on the tall figure in front of the window. Everyone quickly calmed down. Although he hadn't said a single word, he was like a boulder in their hearts. As long as he was here, there would be a chance. Sooner or later, they would succeed. Their eyes turned a little and they could clearly see the face of the figure in front of the window. Set off by his black armor, he exuded a powerful aura like that of a heavenly god. This was another familiar face. If Qin Yu could see this, he would remember the powerful existence he had seen during his conflict with Princess Lushi. The Whale Sovereign. Standing in front of the window, this person who had packaged himself well and was the cornerstone of the nation in the eyes of countless sea folk was currently frowning. But unexpectedly, Jing Guanjin's failure, Wu Zetian's loss of the purple card, the chance to obtain the companion vine, the loss of the Southern River office, he hadn't thought about any of these things. This was because in the Whale Sovereign's opinion, changing the heavens and earth was difficult to begin with. Any accidents or failures were normal. What he was thinking was why this Honorable Ning Qin, Honorable Ning, gave him an inexplicable sense of loathing and familiarity. Others might not care about this sort of feeling, but after his cultivation reached this step and he had nearly formed divine soul, he could faintly sense this. Unfortunately, he was about to die. Beneath such a powerful heavenly tribulation, his body and soul would likely turn to ash. There was no way for him to investigate anything. At this time, in the capital city, everyone that had gathered here believed that Honorable Ning would die. This was because heavenly tribulation didn't care about anything else, only absolute strength. The Whale Sovereign thought this, Superman thought this, Old Sea thought this, and even the two squads that had arrived at around the same time. The young girl pushed open the window. Her eyes widened in surprise as she looked at the heavenly tribulation falling down from the tribulation clouds. She could feel the annihilating aura it emitted and subconsciously shrank her neck. She whispered, "Seventh Auntie, is the one crossing tribulation Honorable Ning?" The woman's complexion darkened. She squeezed out a smile and nodded. Things had changed beyond her expectations. Honorable Ning was actually crossing tribulation, and it was the legendary death tribulation. Borrowing Honorable Ning's momentum, Sea Spirit Pavilion's recent momentum had skyrocketed. It seemed as if they were going to climb to the top in a single swoop. Now, they would surely suffer heavy losses, and they might even have to face the counterattack of other sea spirit influences. The young girl didn't know what sort of difficulties her family would encounter. She only looked at the spirit stone mountain and sighed. This Honorable Ning was truly rich, but at the same time, she felt pity for him. Perhaps the most painful matter in the world was to have endless wealth but not have the life to spend it. Shuijing frowned for the first time. A cold and harsh killing aura swept out like a wave of ice, rapidly clearing away the surrounding sea spirits. The sea spirits were all panic-stricken. Where did this person come from? His aura was so terrifying. Within the carriage, the vice priest's eyes were dim and bitter. He had originally thought he had seen a glimmer of hope, but who would have thought that his gamble would lead to such a result? Was it fate that made a fool out of them, or was it predestined that moon-praying shrine's destiny had come to an end? The white-dressed woman's eyes were filled with sorrow. She opened her mouth, wanting to comfort him, but she discovered that her heart was in chaos and she didn't know what to say. She looked past the window and at the giant sphere of spirit stones. Moon-praying shrine's hope was right there, within reach. But in the end, it had come too late. The fourth heavenly tribulation brought with it an aura of annihilation. Like this, it crossed the world and arrived. Just as it was about to touch the spirit stone, it suddenly vanished from sight. This was normal. Heavenly tribulation couldn't be avoided. Unless external karma interfered, then no matter where you hid, it would be able to cross all barriers and descend upon you. What followed next should be a splendid display of fireworks. A cultivator cultivated to defy the heavens and change their destiny. They absorbed the spiritual strength of the heavens and earth into their body, transforming it into their cultivation and strength. When a cultivator died beneath heavenly tribulation, an invisible will would descend, returning everything to its origin and fusing back into the world. In other words, a cultivator's cultivation and magic power would be restored to spiritual strength. This process was extremely beautiful and breathtaking, thus it was called fireworks. Of course, these fireworks represented the violent death of a tribulation-seizing cultivator every time. Perhaps it would be more appropriate to call them the saddest fireworks in the world. 1 breath of time passed. 2 breaths of time passed. 3 breaths of time passed. It was calm as ever.